we'll take a look at it, and then we may decide to put in the black louvers.
Okay, you want to put the black louvers? Oh.
At the end when it's all said and done.
Okay. You want to...
We may need it, we may not need it. We'll adjust it. I think that's most probably adjusted correct, and you adjust the other ones on that angle.
Okay.
Bring the louvers up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the curtain, and then I'm just going to look at the light level. I think we may have to adjust that one a little bit. I'll tweak them all a little bit.
You don't want to put the jaw frame?
Don't need the jump frame.
Oh,
Just the black louver. Try and straighten it out a little bit and try to get an even cast over the back wall. I want to turn off the overheads. There we go. Okay. Thanks, guys. That's it.
No problem. You want to put it back?
You can bring those down again. What I'm trying to do is rehang that one all together, move it a little closer
Okay.
to get it even, because it's the way I had it set up for the previous shooting was fine, but for this we're going to try and get it absolutely even, and I have to relocate that head. So I'm going to get some pipes and some clamps.
Peter, I emailed you all that information.
Okay. As that hangs, it's going to relax a bit and those wrinkles will come out. actually, there's two different batches. So that'll really show the resolving power of that ultimate system. And the pass-through. I'm just going to tweak that one over a little more. Just bring it over a bit. And the edges are dropping a bit. It's all within a manageable range, but it's nice to be as close as I can, and we have the luxury of time to do it, so I figure we'll try it. I just edge it over a bit. You want to sort of pick where you want to have your talent so that we're out of this light, or we have to put a bottom shelf on these to try to keep it off your subject, just to keep any of that spill light from falling down onto them. In some cases it works that it falls on the subject, but if this is a night shot and you're trying to keep it, keep your subject isolated from the screen, then you'll have to try to cut that spill coming back down this way. Adding a barn door as a bottom, so that when you have your subject down there, we're not getting spill light onto the subject. Thank you. That's it. Yeah, see, that's much better. Now we're going up, I am hotter at the top, which normally what I'll do is I'll tilt it down more, and since we have the barn doors, it'll help cut some of that away. hot. The top of the screen was a little hot, and by angling it, the fixture even more, I was able to tone down the top of the screen and get a little more onto the bottom. That evened out the top to bottom. Left to right, it was okay. Top to bottom, it was about 3/10 of a stop. I'm trying to keep it within about a 1/10 to 2/10 of a stop variance. Yeah, see now we're. We have a slight screen mismatch, so it'll be interesting to see how the Ultimate resolves that, because that's giving us a slightly different reflectance value as well. But essentially, that's evenly lit now. I'll just put a bottom shelf right across it. I've got another cutter here. Now we're just going to bridge the gap between the two in terms of the bottom cutter, so that we don't get that extra spill. The center cutter is bridging the gap between the two bottomers in this way. As the subject stands this close underneath the lights that are illuminating the blue screen, you don't have any of that spill hitting the subject. Now, it wouldn't really matter if we're shooting a day scene to get the spill off of it, but in that we're doing a night scene. Get rid of any spill so that we have full control over how we light the actor. So now that we've blocked all the spill light off the lights that are lighting the blue screen, we can now illuminate our subject matter without any worries about having that spill light affecting our night scene look. 320. Let's see. And what's our shutter speed?
More than likely 1/60. I'm going to shoot it standard
60?
1/60. Yeah.
60. Okay. We're splitting it 228.
228.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Perfect. Wide open, almost wide open, but not quite.
Well, again, I'm not sure. You may even end up underexposing the blue,
Yeah.
depending on how the
Right.
spectral responds.
Yeah, we're going to do that 50%, so we'll probably be at f4 actually.
You might end up
Our
being
exposure,
you
yeah.
might end up being there.
So today we're going to be talking a little bit about compositing. Compositing is the process where you bring multiple images together to make one final composite image or one final complete image. The most common way to achieve a composite in today's digital world is with either a green or a blue screen chroma key, where basically a piece of software or a piece of hardware is able to take the color that you choose. It can be blue, it can be green, it can actually be any color of the spectrum, and isolate that color and actually cut a hole in the image wherever that color appears. That hole allows another piece of footage to come through. The idea behind this is to then allow an element that doesn't exist in an environment to be brought in after the fact. Certainly green and blue screen are the two most common colors for chroma keying. The primary reason for that is that those are the two colors that have the least component in Caucasian flesh tones. So the idea is you want to create as much separation in the color space between your foreground and background. Most people have a human being in the foreground, so by separating the color from flesh tone, blue and green are ideal. In the case today with Jennifer, we're actually going to be shooting a blue screen because she's wearing green clothing. Typically in digital, you'll want to shoot green before blue, since green is the cleanest color channel in digital video. In this case, we actually have a compelling reason not to because of the necessary wardrobe for our scene. Blue tends to be a little bit noisier, so we have to be a little bit more careful with how we light the screen, but certainly blue screen will work. Likewise, if you're shooting something that has blue and green components, you can always shoot a magenta screen, you can shoot a red screen. Really, any color is keyable, but obviously you will want to make sure your subject matter is not similar to that background. That's the big idea. One of the other key components whenever you're shooting blue and green screen, probably the most critical thing you can do to save yourself in post is to make sure that your green screen is evenly lit. Basically, the idea is the keyer needs to have a single value, a single color and luminance value to understand is the area you want to cut out. If it has too many values, you'll start getting areas where the keyer is confused. Is this the background or is this the foreground? So what you want to do is actually have one consistent color across the entire background so that the keyer doesn't have to think about too much. The most critical element, secondary to the evenness of the green screen, is the edges of your foreground object. Essentially, green screen is only concerned with outlining the area that your foreground and background change. The keying component really doesn't care about the center of your foreground object. You're actually going to be applying a separate mat, a background mat or a foreground garbage mat, to be able to keep that area clean. What you're mostly concerned with is to make sure that all of your edges are both sharp, in focus, and complete. In this case right now, the way we're framed up, Jennifer's head is very slightly being cropped at the top. That prevents us from being able to ever move her down in the screen. She won't have the top of her head. So framing for green screen is less about the aesthetic composition of your shot and more about making sure that the entire edge of your object is in frame and in front of the green screen at all times. It's not really important to have your green screen cover the entire frame. The only thing you have to make sure of is that the green screen actually is getting the edges of your foreground object. In fact, it's actually a good idea to block out any portion of the green screen or blue screen that's not being used to prevent spill. Spill is a situation where the blue backing or green backing actually invades your foreground. Since what we care about the most is the edges, one key component that you have to be concerned with is to make sure that those edges don't have any blue or green spill. Spill is the situation where the environment, because it contains such a large, well-lit area of a particular color, that color is going to tend to want to bleed into your subject. By keeping your subject the greatest distance possible from the screen, you're able to minimize this. Another way to minimize it is by keeping the chroma color out of the environment around your foreground subject. So make sure that your floor, walls that are outside of you, and even the area of the screen that's not being taken up by the foreground are covered in black or some neutral color that's going to be able to absorb or more specifically not reflect your keying color. The idea is to keep all instances of the keying color, the only place that the keying color exists is in your background. Since the edges of our foreground are the most critical part of any compositing or keying action, we want to make sure that those edges are clean and free of any spill from the chroma key background color. The most common cause of spill is actually the background itself. Because we need to light the background to such a high degree, that light has a tendency to spill or to move around the foreground subject, contaminating your edges and making a clean key very difficult, if not impossible. When you're dealing with a stage that is using a cove, where the green material is covering both the wall and the floor, the nice thing is that it allows you to actually get a full head-to-toe shot of your foreground element to composite them completely into your composite or your background. The challenge with these environments is that now you actually have green material to the sides and in some cases in front of your character. You have to light that material to be able to keep a consistent luminance value, as we talked about before, but that lighting will actually cause it to bounce back into your foreground subject, contaminating it with your key color and making the key difficult. The key to try and keep that from happening is to only have green or blue in the area directly around your foreground subject. Use flags, black duvetine, any kind of neutral color you can to minimize the amount of green in your space. You want to try and have only the green appearing in your background as it appears directly around your subject, taking into account any movements they may make. In situations where you're only dealing with a single wall color, where you're not in a cove situation, it's quite easy actually to control spill. When your composite doesn't require a freestanding foreground element, you can shoot basically with just a background chroma key cloth, similar to what we're shooting today. The nice thing with this is we don't have to worry about the green and blue screen material being underneath our character and in front of them. So we can actually separate the character physically by moving them as far away from the background as your framing and your environment will allow. This is where actually having a large space for green screen is critical. Most people underestimate the amount of space that green screen requires, and likewise the size of the screen. The further away the camera and the subject are from the screen, the larger the screen will need to be. General rule of thumb, if you're talking about trying to shoot even just a waist-up shot, you need at least a 12 by 12 screen, oftentimes more than that if you're trying to get any kind of movement or action. The room we're in today is about 20 foot by 30 foot, which I would say is the minimum size necessary for anything that's going to involve more than a single person or more than a single head-to-toe shot. If you're doing an interview where you're trying to just composite somebody in for, say, a corporate video, you can probably get away with a smaller screen because you're only dealing with a head-to-shoulder shot. An additional challenge with shooting in smaller environments is it's much more difficult to control where the light is going in the room. If you find yourself in a small environment, as is often the case, one trick that you can use to be able to help your edges out if you do have a spill problem is to actually use rim light to your advantage. One little trick is actually to use a complementary color in gel on your rim light to essentially counteract or cancel out the spill that's occurring. Be very careful not to overdo this. What you actually need to do is, hopefully you have an incident meter available to you, or if not, you can actually use your spot meter in your camera. You want to only apply just enough of that colored rim light to counteract the blue. You don't actually want to use that color as a lighting effect. It tends to be overdone and looks fake, and it actually can hurt the composite. It makes it feel green screened or makes it feel fake. All you're trying to do is provide as much light on the subject as is bouncing back from the green screen or blue screen material. That's it. If you want a rim light, add another light that's not colored and set that for your proper exposure based on the aesthetics you're trying to achieve. The purpose for flagging off areas of the green screen that aren't going to be contacted by your foreground element is to actually prevent the blue from causing a lens flare in the lens of the camera. If the green screen is lit properly, it's going to be providing ample amount of light to actually register as a light source to the camera. That light source can cause flare. So by minimizing it, bringing flags between the camera and your background, almost creating a garbage mat on set, is critical. The keying process is only concerned with the foreground element. Anything that is outside of that foreground element is considered garbage. In keying, a garbage mat is the first step in the process, whereby you remove any extraneous pieces of information that's not part of your foreground. This could be a C-stand that happens to be in frame for a tracking marker, or it could be a flag that's being used to control spill from the background. A common misconception is that you need to have your chroma key color covering the entire screen from left to right, top to bottom. This actually can harm you. By having that much blue in your frame, you have the potential for creating a lens flare that will actually allow a certain amount of blue light to contaminate your foreground element, which, as we've already covered, is something you want to avoid at all costs. By bringing additional flags or anything really to block that extra blue, you're able to control that lens flare. This brings us to something called a garbage mat. The reason you don't have to have blue covering your entire frame is that one of the first steps in the keying process is to provide a rough cutout, basically almost like a very coarse rotoscope, around your foreground object, essentially throwing away everything that you don't want in the frame. This garbage mat can then later on be refined and turned into a much more detailed mat that is what rotoscoping is truly about. Rotoscoping is the process of actually manually tracing the outline of your foreground object. Hopefully you won't have to do rotoscoping if your green screen or blue screen composite was done correctly in the first place, but rotoscoping is often a common option to be able to fix problems. Now, with all this conversation about how important it is to have an evenly lit green screen or blue screen, you've probably noticed by now that the screen behind me is not ideal. We actually had an opportunity to choose a few different screens, and I chose this one specifically to show you some of the common issues that you're going to have to deal with. Primarily wrinkles, inconsistencies in the screen material. This is actually not as big of a problem as it used to be. The current digital keyers, especially software and the new hardware keyers, are actually able to do a pretty decent job of allowing you to apply multiple passes to the key, where you're actually going to key out one color, in this case the lighter color on the bottom first, and then you'll be able to key out the second color second. It's not ideal, but it is a real-world situation. Oftentimes you don't have the opportunity to have things perfect. Your main job isn't perfection, it's trying to get it as good as possible on the day. There's always going to be issues that get in your way from creating that perfect key. If you can get it perfect, then congratulations. You're probably in the top 5% of people shooting. For the rest of us, issues are a common thing to deal with. Another nice little trick if you're trying to match the sun angle for your background plate is if you know where it was shot and at least the rough date that it was shot, you have the ability to look up in a sun table the exact position of the sun at that given time on that date. This then allows you to use an inclinometer to match that same angle actually down to the degree on stage. For the most part, you probably don't need to be completely accurate in this regard. You're just trying to get a rough estimation of what your match to the background needs to be. The inclinometer actually helps us out in another way. Not only are you worried about matching the angle of lighting, you also need to be worried about matching the camera's angle relative to your foreground subject as the camera was relative to the background. Having an inclinometer while you're shooting your background plate along with a tape measure is critically important. You need to be able to measure not only the height of the lens from the ground, you also need the distance of the lens from your background object, and more importantly, from the intended position of your foreground object, so that you can match that distance on the stage. This is also going to help you decide the size of your stage. If you shoot a foreground element that's a quarter mile away, you're going to need a pretty big stage. And parking lot probably is going to be your best answer at that point. So you're going to want to measure to the center of the barrel of the lens as it sits in your correct position. In this case, it's about 34.5 inches. Not only are you looking at lens height, but also lens angle. This is where actually having a little bit of pre-knowledge of your foreground object is important. When you're shooting the plate, you need to make sure that you're leaving enough room for your foreground object. If you're framing for someone who's 5'7", and your background plate photographer, if it doesn't happen to be you, decides he's framing for somebody who's, say, 4 feet tall, or somebody who's 6'5", the framing's not going to match. You have the ability to adjust, but ideally you'll want to get it right the first time. Now, if you don't have the luxury of shooting your own background plates and you're pulling plates from someone else, if you can find out where those plates were shot, specifically latitude and longitude, what time of day, and what day of the year, you can actually use sun tables to calculate the sun angle for matching. Once you've looked up your sun table, you can actually use a tool called an inclinometer that allows you to tell exactly where in space the sun was at any given moment, which is essentially a small compass and a meter that allows you to actually judge the incline in degrees of whatever you're happening to look at. In the case of the sun, you're actually going to use the sighting feature, which allows you to actually judge by looking through the scope exactly where your object happens to be, in this case the sun. For the camera, you're going to use the straight edge on the bottom of the inclinometer on a known surface of the camera or tripod. Basically, you want to pick any flat horizontal surface, whether it be the camera plate, possibly the top of the camera handle if you know you're going to be using that same camera on stage. This way you're able to document in your logbook exactly what angle the camera was shooting from when you shot your plate. When you're on stage, you'll be able to match that angle with the same tool using the same methodology. A little bit of preparation while you're shooting your plates is going to make your green screen and blue screen composite easier and more effective. While you're shooting your plates, it's important, as we mentioned, to get both the height of the camera angle, the distance of the camera from the foreground object, and the distance from the camera from any additional background objects that you may need to replicate. If you don't have a tape measure and an inclinometer with you, a convenient way to be able to judge those is using the internal controls of the camera, in this case using your focus to help you determine the distance to a distant object. By zooming in and focusing on, say, a car that's parked across a parking lot, your focus indicator and display on the camera is going to be able to give you a replicatable reference that if you're using that same camera on stage, you can then dial in. This is where having a logbook with you on set is critically important. You need to be able to write down all of the information that you're keeping for every shot and keep that actually as an ongoing record with that shot through the entire post-process. For height, you can actually use your known tripod settings. If you don't have a tape measure to actually give yourself feet and inches, only work in either full or half risers on your tripod. So you can remember, okay, in your logbook I'll write down this particular shot was shot with the tripod at its lowest possible setting. That way when you get into the stage, using that same tripod or a similar model, put that tripod at its lowest possible setting and you've got a match. If you know, okay, it's a stick and a half, then it's easy to be able to judge that and replicate it on stage. And the last piece of information that you're going to want to make sure to record while you're shooting your plate is what focal length your zoom is set to on your camera. This is actually one of the most important things to match in the foreground and background composite because the lens distortion needs to be as similar as possible. There are software tools that can mimic the look of a different lens, say a fisheye versus a telephoto, but the less work that you have to do in post, the better. To help achieve an even lighting on your background, using soft sources is very helpful. A soft source or a broad source is going to help wrap around any inconsistencies in the texture of the screen, whether it be wrinkles or actually the material itself. For this reason, KinoFlow or large size fluorescent lighting has been very popular for lighting blue screens and green screens. In our case, we're actually making use of a little feature with KinoFlow lights. Because the 2900 degree Kelvin globe is slightly off from a traditional tungsten source, we're actually going to want to do a manual white balance with the camera to match that source. This is also going to be a consideration with our background. If the background needs a particular color cast, you're going to want to try and get the camera on set to match it as close as possible. An easy way to do that is actually with a Jungle Book, which is basically a free sample of gels. You can do your white balance through a gel, essentially applying an electronic filter to the camera in advance of shooting. That way your background and foreground can match a little bit better. Another trick with these gels, if you're using dado lights like we are today for some of our rim sources, it just so happens that the 4x4 size is a perfect size to fit in front of a dado light. So essentially from a free sample you get as many gels as you could possibly want to better be able to match those background sources. Now the adage "fix it in post" is typically met with disdain, and rightfully so. There is, however, one situation in compositing where you actually want to fix it in post. It's actually a common misconception or a common mistake to try and adjust your camera settings for your particular aesthetic look, whether it be, say, an extreme color cast like in the movie Traffic. If you apply those kinds of effects in camera, and this includes using diffusion filters, that effect is actually going to not only affect your foreground, which is what you're trying to achieve, it's also going to have an impact on your background, your blue screen. So that wonderful orange cast that you've done is actually canceling out the blue from your blue screen, and it's going to make the composite more difficult. This is the one instance when fix it in post is the right thing to do. I mentioned diffusion. Diffusion while shooting blue screen is a very, very major no-no. It's a big problem. Diffusion is designed to take detail away, and more specifically to soften edges. That's why we like it. It makes the blemishes on skin soften and smooth away. But it's also going to reduce the amount of detail available to the compositing software or hardware to be able to tell the difference between your green screen and your foreground. The nice thing is software has been developed to be able to apply very convincing diffusion effects after the fact. Once your composite's done, you can then treat that footage to match the remaining footage of the rest of your production. It's critically important to not do this on the day. This is the one section where fix it in post is actually the correct thing to do. When you're shooting your background plate, it's appropriate to have that plate match the rest of your footage, whether it be with filtration or a color cast. But you want to make sure when you're shooting the foreground element that that element is as clean and as vanilla as possible. Then use your post-production color correction capabilities to adjust that foreground element to fit and match your background and to match the rest of your footage. If you try and do this in camera while you're shooting on stage, you'll actually have a negative impact on your background, and that negative impact can make the key much more difficult. Once you've got your background lit to your satisfaction, you've essentially finished the hardest part, which is the purely technical, just getting the screen lit evenly. Then you get into the fun stuff. This is where you actually get to turn on your aesthetic brain and get creative. This is where you get to dive into your background plate. Hopefully you've shot your plate photography prior to the green screen. It's much more difficult to imagine in your mind what your background's going to look like than if you actually have it sitting right in front of you and you can analyze it. In that analysis, you'll want to take a look at things like the type of light that is present in your environment. In our case, we're dealing with a night scene that's in kind of an industrial complex that has mixed color sources. This is actually kind of a nice thing for us because it gives us the ability to have interactive light that exists both in our foreground element and is seen in the background. In this case, we have a few different colors of street light. We've got a kind of a warm amber sodium vapor light, and then there's a mercury light that's a cooler blue. We'll actually use those colors in our green screen setup as part of the lighting to help tie the background and foreground together. Nothing screams bad compositing worse than having mismatched lighting between your foreground and background. Second only to lighting the background properly is lighting the foreground properly. You want to make sure that you've taken into account the environmental light that was there. If you're shooting a daylight scene, you may want to go with a broad source that's going to give you a soft light to match that overcast day. Another example might be if you're in, say, a living room and you have a hard shaft of sunlight coming through a window in the background. You can use that hard light on stage so that you feel that coming back to the foreground element. Another thing to think about is the floor. Most situations where you're in a natural environment, light is bouncing around off of all the surfaces that are there. We already talked about how much you want to try and control spill in your green screen, so your stage is most likely a giant black box like we're in today. Most likely your background won't be a giant black box. You'll be, say again, in that living room. So your job is to try and create those bounce sources from the floor, coming from both sides, to be able to match the lighting ratios that's happening in your background. Another thing to be concerned with matching is shadow angle, especially if you're shooting in sunlight. You want to make sure that the key source for your foreground element is coming from a matched direction and hopefully from a matched angle of incidence to the lighting that was happening in your background. An easy way to do that is to look at objects in your background that are of a known size. Say there's a street light or a postal box that you can basically guess the height of. You can then look at the length of the shadow coming from that object and from that calculate what your actual lighting angle needs to be. Really, it's more a thing to do by eye. I don't typically try and get too involved with the geometry of it. If it looks right to you, it's going to look right in the composite. So now that we've covered in broad strokes the technical aspects that are common to all green screens, let's get into the detail work. Let's actually start looking at our background and actually try and find ways to match our lighting from the background to the foreground and really have some fun with the aesthetics. Okay, so let's take a look at what our background plate that we've already shot is, the conditions under which it was shot, and what we're going to be able to try and do to match it in our foreground here in the stage. We basically have a night shot that has a few actually practical sources in the frame, a few street lights. They were probably these are metal halides on the day. They have a little bit of a blue cast, but that also can be adjusted based on the camera settings. What we're mostly concerned with is trying to match that today. We're actually going to use these to motivate a rim source on Jennifer. And because it's a night shot, we actually don't want to overlight her as a foreground object. It's one of the things that's common for people to do is to overlight their foreground. They think just because they're on a stage and they've put all this light on the background that they need to give that same amount of light to the foreground, which is not the case. In this situation, we want to actually light her the same as she would be lit if she actually were with us at the location where we shot the plate. In this case, we're actually going to go with almost entirely rim light and just a small amount of fill for an eye light to bring her eyes out and make sure that we can recognize what's happening, but to really kind of let her stay in the shadows. We want to keep her pretty dark. And it points out a fact that when you're shooting blue screen, the most important thing for lighting your foreground is to light it as if you were at the background plate location. Don't try and make it look pretty to your eye now. Try and make it match what was there, even with imperfections. Sometimes the best way you can sell a key is to have your foreground object be less than perfectly lit, so long as it matches what you had in the background. Now in this frame, we've decided we actually want to have Jennifer on the right side of the frame looking from right to left. This is another thing that's critically important to get correct, is your eye lines. You want to make sure that the actors are aware of how they fit within the remaining space. Whether it be storyboards, floor plans, any kind of written documentation, even pre-visualization, anything you can do to visually communicate to both the cast and the crew how the entire environment is supposed to work, they're going to be able to imagine better what their role is in that environment. In this case, we want to make sure that the eye line works from right to left, because we know in our next shot, which will be our additional characters, they're going to be looking from left to right, so we want to be able to have kind of the shot reverse shot feel, even though they're actually physically separated from some distance within the story. This way we still feel that there's some connection between the characters and that they actually have some relationship to one another, and that there's a 180 line that we're trying to adhere to. Now, because we're dealing in a night scene with practical sources that are very specular or hard sources in the frame, we pretty much want to try and mimic that lighting on stage. We are going to use a little bit of soft light to be able to work as a shadowless fill to be able to bring Jennifer up just enough to get out of the noise floor on the base black level of our cameras, which is another trick you can do. Typically when you're shooting your foreground element, you can light to a slightly higher degree than you would naturally to be able to get a cleaner signal. But again, you don't want to go to the extent of creatively overlighting. This is done specifically to get a better signal to noise ratio than to make it a creative decision. Above that base signal level, you still are going to have your primary lighting ratios that are what you're trying to do to match. So you have a technical lighting, which is going to bring your base level up to a particular level. Then you have your aesthetic lighting, which is choosing your ratios between, say, your key and your fill. Now we have an opportunity with this background plate because we do have on-camera practicals. We have these specular highlights that are going to give us a nice source of motivated light for our foreground. In the case on Jennifer, we're going to use it as a rim light so that it's coming from a similar direction and feels as if the light that's hitting her is actually coming from the source that we see in the background. Now the reality is we're going to cheat this a fair amount, and you can get away with a lot. Another nice little trick we can do with this once we get it into post is to use a lens flare. Typically this kind of a light would be creating some semblance of a flare on the lens while we were shooting it, if we were shooting it naturally. We can add that flare in post and allow it to bleed ever so slightly over top of the foreground, giving us a third layer in front of our foreground. And that'll actually help to marry the foreground and background together. If you see that lens flare interacting with both the foreground and background, it tricks the eye into thinking that it's all one shot, when in fact it's a composite. The other thing we're looking at, aside from the quality of light, is actually its color. In this case, we're dealing with metal halide lights that have a slight blue cast to it. So on our rim light, we want to make sure that we use the appropriate gel and white balance settings on the camera to be able to maintain that same feel of light. We're dealing in a mixed color scenario as well. As you'll see in the second background plate, we also have sodium vapor. So we have an opportunity to play with multiple light sources, and we can use those light sources and the direction they're coming from to help the audience orient themselves and where we physically are from one shot to the next. So we'll be able to use a small amount of that sodium vapor light in contaminating Jennifer's fill just a little bit so that we can feel, when we cut to the reverse shot, you have a sense as an audience member where she is relative to those amber lights. It's tempting with today's digital still cameras to use them to create a high-resolution background plate. This actually can be quite effective, especially if you have a fisheye lens and are able to do 360-degree shooting or be able to get a panoramic view that you can then choose backgrounds from. When you're using a still image to composite in the background, it doesn't have the characteristic random noise and natural movement that happens within even a still frame on video. So if you are going to use a still camera, you want to make sure that you are able to add a little bit of a noise component to that to be able to better match your foreground footage, and so it doesn't feel like it's a dead frame. Now in this case, the background plate was shot with the camera at a fairly low angle looking up to the buildings in the distance. We're going to want to make sure we match that same basic lens angle today on stage. Now we did have an inclinometer on set when we shot the background, so I know exactly what angle we need to adjust for. The nice thing with having this measurement is it means that I now can deal in relative distances. I don't have to have the camera at exactly the same height as it was on the day when I shot the background plate. All I need to do is have it at the same height relative to my foreground object. In certain circumstances, it may be beneficial to have your foreground object, say, sitting down rather than standing up. Say if you're having them on a turntable to be able to do a 360-degree dolly shot. Say on an apple box if necessary, or even sitting on their knees. If you don't have enough screen to have them standing, you can actually have them either sitting down on an apple box or on their knees, and all you have to worry about is making sure that the height ratios between the camera and the foreground object match to be able to get your angle of inclination. It's a convenient way to work, and it makes your life a lot easier. And now when I come in, the first thing I'll try and do is rough in the camera, getting it in generally the correct position and angle so that I can find out if there's any issues or any problems from the work that's already been done on the green screen. For instance, do we need to move the screen up or down a little bit to better accommodate the shot? Once we have it roughed in, I'm not really going to focus too much on getting the camera settings perfect until I've done most of my lighting. I actually like to try and get at least the rough lighting looks figured out first, and then I can make my fine-tuned adjustments to the camera right before I shoot. That way I'm basically working more from my eye and not so much from the monitor. If you're working off the monitor, it's very easy, especially in a green and blue screen environment, for your eye to get inappropriately adjusted to those colors, throwing your entire perception off. This is also where a vector scope comes in and a waveform monitor. Let's make some adjustments to make sure that the camera is giving us the best possible image. In this case, we're shooting with the Panasonic HVX200. It's a high-definition camera that records 4:2:2 color signal. This is important for green screen and blue screen because the more color information we have, the cleaner our key can be. If you're shooting DV or HDV, you're shooting in a 4:1:1 color space. So you're actually dealing with a multiplier less information. You actually have less resolution in the color channels than you would, say, in a 4:2:2 camera like the HVX. Ideally, we would be shooting 444, which would be an uncompressed signal. These cameras are very expensive, and there's a good reason why most of us can't get into that class of camera. That's okay. We can still shoot really good keys even with the most inexpensive of cameras. In fact, there's companies that have come up with specific software that's designed to overcome this limitation. DV Garage, being one of them, has a wonderful product called DV Matte that actually takes the luminance information and uses it to create the edge detail, while taking the chrominance information only to get the coarse outline of the main matte. So it is possible to get a good key off of DV. It's just a little trickier. On the HVX, we want to make sure first that we're shooting in the format that gives us the cleanest signal possible. In this case, we're going to go for a high resolution, so we're shooting at 1080 at 60i. This is also to match the remaining footage of the rest of our project. If we're shooting a 24p project, then we would want to make sure that we're in that same setting for our compositing footage as well. It's also very important to make sure that your foreground footage and background footage are shot in the same frame rate and the same style, whether it be progressive or interlaced. Trying to mix these is a very, very difficult process and usually results in a key that's not going to be to your liking. So we're shooting today in 1080i. One of the reasons we want to shoot a high resolution, oftentimes even higher resolution than your final product, is you can downscale to your final release. In this case, we're going to be going to DVD, so it's a standard definition final project. By shooting in HD, though, we're actually able to do the composite at a higher level of detail than the final product. When we do that downscale to the final release size, any imperfections that may remain in the key are usually softened and lost in that downscale process. So no matter what your final deliverable is, you want to try and find a camera that's going to give you an increased resolution over that. In the case of the HVX, I typically shoot in 720 mode for the majority of my projects, and I reserve the 1080 for those opportunities when I'm doing a composite just like this. By kicking up into 1080 mode, I get the additional resolution, and then I do the downscale in post to match my existing footage, making the composite that much smoother. So once we have our camera in the appropriate recording mode, we want to go ahead and set its internal functions to give us the cleanest signal possible for our key. So in this case, we're going to go back up to our scene file menu and make a few changes. The first setting we come to on the HVX is shutter speed. This is often overlooked when shooting green screen and is actually very critical to getting a high quality key. When you shoot at a slow shutter speed, you get the benefit of having additional exposure, which is sometimes helpful. But in this case, it gives you an artifact that you don't want, motion blur. Now in most shooting circumstances, and most of the films that you're going to shoot, you want to have a little bit of motion blur. It gives a smooth, kind of nice, even feel to the movement on frame. Unless you're doing something like Saving Private Ryan, where you want to emphasize that staccato kind of pixelated feel. In the case of green screen, you actually want to shoot at a higher shutter speed than you typically would to minimize that motion blur. Motion blur in green screen is almost the same as being out of focus. You're creating a soft edge, which is much harder for a keyer to be able to define. That motion blur actually gives you a gradient as opposed to a hard line. By shooting at a higher shutter speed, you're going to capture motion in a more hard-edged style that then later in post, again, you can add that motion blur back in to match your existing footage. It results in a cleaner key, but still can be adjusted to match what you've already shot. So in our case, we're actually going to shoot at a 60th shutter speed, which is actually not set up here. That's a preset. Going down through the list, you want to turn your detail all the way down or off if possible. Detail is actually an electronic circuit that sits between the lens and the recording mechanism of your camera that artificially adds additional enhancement to the edges. This enhancement actually can result in a worse key, especially in DV, where it'll actually show itself as a black line surrounding your object. So what you want to try and do, in some cameras you can turn it off, but in most you're only going to be able to set it to its minimum setting. So the first thing is to turn your detail completely down or off. The same goes for vertical detail, although it's less critical on the HVX. In this case, we're going to leave it at 0. Your chroma level is another area that people tend to make a common mistake. They think, well, if I'm supposed to make my blue screen really blue, I'm just going to crank my chroma level really high, and then I'll have a great blue. The problem with artificially enhancing that blue is that you have the potential of overdoing it. You can actually go into clipping, which is a point that you actually are overloading the CCD of the chip and overloading the digital signal processor. When that happens, you begin to lose detail in that color channel. In the case of losing detail in our blue, you'll actually start to bleed into the edges of your foreground, actually increasing not only your background blue, but also that spill we talked about earlier. So increasing your chroma in camera is actually a step in the wrong direction. Basically leave it neutral, leave it as vanilla as you can. In this case, we'll leave it at 0. Now, chroma phase is a circuit that's very similar to white balance in that it allows you to change the colors on your frame. The difference is it actually is rotating the color wheel, so you're actually able to lean your footage slightly towards magenta, slightly towards green. In the case of a blue screen or a green screen background, there are certain limited keyers that require a very specific color of blue or a very specific color of green. If you don't happen to have a backing that matches that, you can adjust your chroma phase to achieve this color. It's fairly rare and something you're probably never going to have to deal with, but it's good to know that it exists. The one thing to be careful, though, is you are shifting not only your background, but your foreground as well. So any phase adjustments you make will have an impact on the way your foreground is rendered that you're most likely then, after you've completed the key, going to need to push back in the other direction to return to neutral. Color temperature is an adjustment on the HVX that allows us to change our white balance selectively. We can white balance on a white card and then creatively push it towards a warmer or a cooler color cast. As we mentioned before, you want to avoid doing this when you're shooting green screen because that color cast is also going to affect the background. With the background warmer, let's say, you're actually bleeding color out of the blue screen. If you were to go cooler, you're artificially adding additional blue, similar to increasing the chroma, which can get you in that same clipping problem we talked about a second ago. So again, color temperature is for post, not for the camera when you're shooting your foreground element. So we'll leave that at 0. And then we're going to set our pedestal. Pedestal is our relative black level. This is actually a place where you can use some creative license in terms of trying to match your background footage. This is the one area that I would say having some creative freedom on set while you're shooting your blue screen is appropriate. The screen itself has a high enough luminance value that your pedestal really isn't going to have much of an effect. The one situation where you may find yourself having an issue, similar to what we have today, is a screen that has wrinkles that you can't get out of it. Those wrinkles actually will read as a slightly lower value. So by crushing your blacks, you may enhance those wrinkles, something you might not want to do. One of your main goals is to try and get your camera out of your way. The cameras do a lot of work for you. There's a lot of circuitry in place to try and enhance the image to give you the best possible picture creatively. Sometimes this creative enhancement can actually be a technical problem for keying. So one of the things we're trying to do is create as vanilla a settings for the camera as possible. We're trying to have the camera do the least amount of processing to the footage before it gets recorded so that we have more room to do our own processing in post. There's varying schools of thought on how appropriate this is, but for the most part, testing has proven that keeping your camera as vanilla as possible is really going to do wonders for helping your key. Your gamma settings and your knee curves really should be adjusted to get the cleanest possible signal in the blue channel. This is going to vary from camera to camera and from setting to setting. So this is where the one most important element in all of this comes in, which is testing. All of the rules of thumb, all the little things, tips and tricks that we've been telling you today are a very helpful starting point, but really testing is the only way that you can put those concepts into practice and find out how it applies to your specific camera, your specific backdrop, your specific lighting, and even your specific software or hardware keyer. Every step along that chain is going to have its own slight variances from the rule of thumb. So by all means, test, test, and test some more. So with this screen and the keyer we're planning to use, we've pretty much determined that HD norm is going to give us a nice even feel with kind of minimizing the noise in our blue channel. The blue channel, as we mentioned before, tends to be a noisier channel in DV, but because we're going with green fatigues in the wardrobe, we have to stick to a blue screen rather than the cleaner green screen. If you have a chance or the opportunity, typically green screen is going to give you a slightly better key in DV or HDV or DVC Pro. What you're looking for in this case, because we are using blue screen, is how much noise you're getting in the blue channel. You want to go with whatever setting minimizes that noise without having an adverse effect on the color cast of your foreground. A nice handy trick for doing that is actually to use an engineering monitor with a blue-only switch. By switching to blue-only, you're only seeing the blue gun and only seeing the blue channel. By looking at that, you can easily identify by cycling through your settings which one looks the cleanest. That's the setting you're going to want. If you have the opportunity to shoot green screen, I would recommend doing so over blue screen when you're shooting for either digital, whether it be DV, even HD cam. Really, any digital format is going to like green a little bit better than blue. Green is a cleaner channel, and you should shoot it if you have the opportunity. In this case today, we're shooting with green fatigues, so green's out of the question for the background color, so blue would be the best second choice. Lastly, we're going to keep our matrix off for the same reason we didn't do any kind of creative white balancing. Again, this is a place where we want to adjust in post, not in the camera. And skin tone detail. This is another one people typically make a mistake. They'll turn skin tone detail on, thinking that they're helping to smooth out their actor's features and make your ingenue feel like she's 10 years younger. That's a good thing to do, but again, this is something we want to do in post, not in camera. By turning that detail on in camera, you're also going to have an effect softening the edges of your frame and can adversely affect the key. So we'll keep skin detail off. I'll save our settings so we don't lose them when we change batteries. And we're ready to shoot. So, how much am I getting off in that?
Should I take this off since they don't have any? Since you guys don't?
No, it's okay. That's fine. Just leave it on for now, and then we'll do it in the scene later. What are you doing there?
Basically, we're just rigging up a little sling. The cable for the mini flow. The mini flow is typically used as an on-camera light, so it doesn't have a mounting solution or a long enough cable to be used like we're using it now with the stand. So just kind of doing a little bit of a rig to let it hang off the C-stand so that I've got enough cable. Let's just step on the other one. So what we're doing here is, because there's the brim on Jennifer's hat, I'm actually just trying to set my eye light, which is kind of working as a little bit of a fill. And because it's a night scene, it's honestly going to be my key. I'm not really going to be doing much else to the front. But what I want to do is be able to get it just to the right angle to reach under the brim of her hat to get a spark off of both her right and left eye. Because of the nature of the rest of the scene, we're trying to keep it pretty aerial. I want to keep it high and feel ambient, and also to help me keep shadows off the back of the screen.
And what are you doing there?
Right now I'm trying to replicate, we have one of the practicals in the background is coming from a pretty high angle off of her left shoulder. So I'm trying to get an approximation of what it feels like coming from that light. But it's also far enough away that I don't want it to be a tremendous effect, so I'm actually just trying to get a splash of that light as opposed to say something that's pretty hard and direct. I just want to feel just a touch of it. It's kind of a subtle thing.
Are you focusing it, or?
Yeah, so I was getting a little bit too much punch out of it, and it was a little too spotty, so I just flooded it out a little bit. So we were in a spot. You can see that I'm actually trying to waste the hot spot onto the square of her back, because all I'm interested in for the camera is just the edge of the pattern. But even that was a little bit too much, so I'm actually just going to flood it out to allow more of the light to spread out, and we'll waste even a little bit more. Good. I think if we back the dado off a little bit, I think we're pretty darn close. So the same thing applies here. You're really almost more worried with what you're not lighting than what you are lighting, especially because it's a night scene. What I'm trying to do is keep the diva off of the front of her face, but still let it play on her neck and shoulder. That way it still keeps kind of that night feel, and we're letting the mini flow do its job without this becoming too overpowering. Because those practicals, even though they're the brightest thing in the frame, are pretty far away, so we don't want them to feel too present on her. So we're all just ever so slightly, instead of full punch, which is way too bright, we're going to just peel it off of her face just a little bit using the barn door and the louver. But we're still keeping it on her shoulder and neck, so we still feel the effect from that light, but it's not overpowering our mini flow fill. And then the other adjustment we've made with that is actually bringing it from a lower angle, which is helping to match the angle that the practical is coming from. It's because it's diminishing into the background. Its diminishing line is brought lower in the frame, so we're actually trying to feel its effect kind of coming up into her jawline as opposed to being something that's really blaring straight into the face. So I think with that, we look pretty good. So 3 little lights, doesn't have to be much, and now we can turn the blue screen back on, feeling confident that the foreground matches. If I had the blue screen on this whole time, it's much more difficult to judge your lighting ratios because your eye is constantly competing with that overwhelming blue source. There we go. So we're just going to set two of these flags to the left and right of frame to try and knock out as much of the blue screen from the lens as possible to try and minimize our spill. So we're setting this flag basically to the left and right of Jennifer to try and minimize the spill. We're going with a black material again to keep it from bouncing back. Now you probably notice it's pretty dark in here. We've actually turned the blue screen off, all the lighting for the blue screen, to allow me to see and judge accurately what I'm doing on my foreground object. This is really important because it's very easy if you have your blue screen turned on. Your eye adjusts to that lighting level and to the to the tone of the screen. So judging your foreground is really difficult. You basically lose all acuity in your vision if you have the blue screen turned on. So it's really important to keep the blue screen off when you're lighting your foreground. And then once you turn the blue screen back on, make any adjustments you need to possibly increase the level if you have to at that point. But a good base starting point is with the screen off. I wonder, do we have any sandbags?
Yes, sir.
So you can just bag that guy for me. Now the important thing when setting these flags is to know, and hopefully you've had a chance to have a rehearsal at this point, how much movement your foreground object is going to be doing. The main thing you want to do is make sure that your garbage flags don't encroach into the acting space. So say they flail an arm out. If that arm happens to go either in front of or even worse behind the flag, you're not going to be able to key that element. It's either going to disappear or you're going to be forced to rotoscope it. So make sure when you're setting these flags to only set them as close as the movement will allow.
And what are you setting that up for?
This is actually going to be our spill control, and I just disappeared. Thanks. Okay. So this flag is basically acting as our camera left spill control, but it's also helping us with our rim light on Jennifer. Basically that light is positioned for what's ideal for the foreground, but it actually comes into frame. If we were shooting under normal circumstances, that'd be a bad thing, but because it's blue screen, all we're going to do is garbage mat it out anyway. So I'm just trying to use this to keep it from flaring the lens. If I can get it to rip. Good. Okay, so now that we've got the foreground to our liking, we'll turn the blue screen back on and see what problems we've made for ourselves. That's strange. Somehow we lost all the punch out of that diva. That's more like it. There we go. Now we're back. So I just walk that in a little bit. We're ready to go. So can you show me? Let's grab your binoculars. Let's mark your spot first. Where did that spike tape go?
It's right on your camera.
Okay, so let's get you your binoculars. I just want to see where your arms are going to end up. So if you can just go through some of your movements for me real quick. Okay. Go ahead and show me a range. You know, are you going to, at some point, do you duck down, or you pretty much, that's the majority of what you're doing?
For the pop, I'm going to say any fire take cover. And
Good.
I'll just like, because it's going to pop and I'll be like instantly,
Okay, good.
and I'm going to look for wherever it came from.
Good. Okay.
Long arm of the C-stick. There you go.
Thanks. So it looks like that does not have juice.
No?
Yep. Oh wait, there it is.
Here it is?
Yep.
Cool. Because that's strictly illuminated, so I don't know. So what are you
Okay,
doing
so
now?
one of the things that I noticed just now, we ran through some blocking, and when she's working with the binoculars, because she's wearing black gloves, the binoculars in her hands are kind of falling off to nothing. So I'm just adding a little extra splash just for that key element. It's really not going to work on her face at all. It's mostly just to try and feel, so that we don't lose the detail in the black of the gloves and the binoculars. Could you bring them up for me? Good. And could you pull them down? Good. Thanks.
Can you pull it back up and turn that light on and off for me real quick?
Sure. So there's off, back on,
Sweet.
off, on. Okay, that's good, but it's still not quite enough. There we go. And down. Good. And one thing that's helpful, the way you brought them down that time when you tucked them into your chest, if you can do that rather than up and out.
Right, okay.
So tuck it down is good. And back up again. Good. And back up one more time. Okay, so let's turn the blue screen back on and see what kind of damage we did. Which ones are they, 1 through 4?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the top and the bottom.
Okay. Ready for it?
Go for it. So what are we doing there?
So here we're going to be remotely controlling our image 80s, bringing them back up to continue lighting our screen. Because the stage we're shooting in has Grifflon for their floppies as opposed to the traditional flag material, I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit of duvetine over it because we're starting to get a little bit of reflection off the back of it, which is just spiking the lens a little bit.
Either way, just keep it. Oh my God. Can you, yeah, go ahead and smooth that over one more time?
Mm-hmm. Let me just get this piece out. Okay, and can I see you raise the... Good. And back down again? Perfect. Okay, we're ready to shoot. So when you're lobbing somebody, there's something called the Chaka rule, which basically the Hawaiian sign. What you want to do is have the talent do that, put their thumb on their chin, and wherever their pinky ends up is about where you want to put the mic. What tends to happen is if somebody has big hands, they tend to have a bigger voice. It's also a great chance to get people to do that because it looks silly. I think this is probably the only piece of wardrobe that has the perfect little mic pocket built into it. It's great. And we don't even care if we see the cable because you got your headset on. Good.
Use a gaffer's tape or something and bind that
Yeah,
shut?
I think we'll be all right. It's just right there. Just curious to see if this canvas is going to be too noisy. And then let's make sure.
Go for it. Thank you.
Now, this is our mini flow. It's the first light that we set, and it's setting essentially our base level of exposure on Jennifer's face. It's a small fluorescent lamp specifically designed actually as an on-camera light. In this case, we're using it because of its small size. I don't need a lot of light, and all I'm looking for is just a little spark in the eyes, so it works perfect for that. I had to rig a little sling for it so that we could hang it from the C-stand because its cable's pretty short, but it does the job nicely. Okay, so this dado light is actually functioning as one of our practical motivated sources. There's a fairly large light that's the closest light in the background off of her left shoulder. So this light is actually motivated from it. We're taking it from a little bit more of a top side angle than would be natural because we want to see enough wrap to help also delineate the edge of her shoulder. This light also, when we initially set it, aesthetically I actually liked it as a less intense light on her cheek, We increased it though because even though I liked the way it looked, it didn't match the background as well. So this diva light is actually working as essentially, you could call it our key. It is the brightest light on Jennifer's face. It's actually a rim though, because it's motivated from the two lights that are on the lower right edge of the frame. As we bring it on, you'll notice that it's actually a softer light than the dado that we just turned on. Mainly we're doing this because we want to have a nice even skin tone for Jennifer's face. If we go with a hard light, it has a tendency to bring out extra texture in skin tones that's usually not very complementary. The diva light does a nice job of smoothing that out. So this dado light, when we first turn it on, probably looks like it doesn't do much. In fact, that's on purpose. We don't want it to be on Jennifer's face at all when she has the binoculars down. It's there specifically, would you mind raising the binoculars? It's there specifically to show us the front leading edge of the optics of the binoculars. We noticed when we did the first rehearsal after we had our rough in on the lighting that her black gloves and the black binoculars just disappeared into essentially a black hole in the middle of the frame. So this little special works perfect to help bring them out. One thing to be aware of is no matter how good Jennifer is hitting her mark, invariably this light's going to need to be tweaked once or twice as you shoot to get it really right. Okay, so let's take a look at what we did and more specifically why. Basically what you're seeing here is our foreground element in its still blue state, and this is our background plate that we're trying to match. So the main idea, which you saw when we had the blue screen lights turned off, was to be able to keep her feeling like she's in a nighttime environment. The last thing we want to do is blast light at the front of her and you know, make her look like that gorgeous portrait lighting everyone's used to. This isn't a portrait. This is a dramatic piece in a different location, not in front of a portrait studio. So what we've done is really to pull the majority of our references from the three practicals that exist in the frame. So what we've done is actually to provide, using dado lights on one side and a diva on the other. This is the diva that's kind of giving us the nice soft kiss off of her right cheek, and we've got the dado giving us this little sculpture right off of her left shoulder. Starting with the dado, the idea from this one is to feel a little bit of impact, a little bit of effect from this lamp over her left shoulder. It's cheated around. We're actually getting more of a side light than we naturally should, but it still gives the effect, and it also helps us to define the edge and shoulder, which helps us to get a cleaner key, as well as having a motivated source within the scene. The diva that's coming around and actually giving us the majority of our, really the brightest hot spot that we're getting on her face, is motivated from the two lights that are further away. Because they're lower in the frame, we've also brought the diva in from a lower angle, coming up as a kicker that brings her neck out and gives us a really nice, well-defined edge between her neck and the screen, and also gives us a nice highlight across the mouth and up in the eye. The eyes are the most critical part, especially when you're trying to do low-key lighting like this. You can get away with having somebody's face be almost pitch black, but if you've got just a kiss of light, a spark off of the eyes, that gives the audience something to lock into and a way to understand what the character is going through. If you lose the eyes, you lose the audience. So we've set a mini flow up above that you saw me setting earlier that's giving us just a hint of a highlight off of both of her eyes. The key to this, because she had a brim on her hat, was to make sure that that light was just low enough to reach under that brim without feeling like it was coming straight down the barrel at her. We also set, Jennifer, could you raise your binoculars? We did set a special as well for the binoculars. It's another dado light that just gives us enough detail to keep those binoculars from falling off to complete black. When we first set the lights, we didn't have that special, and we noticed that her entire arms, because she's wearing black gloves and the binoculars are black, this just turned into one big shadow with no detail and no interest. So we set another dado off axis. There's no real practical that's motivating this light. It's there for a more utilitarian purpose, which is purely to let people know she's holding binoculars and to let them register better on camera. Really, that's about it. 4 small lights. It doesn't have to be a lot to get something that matches quite nice. So you may notice that, as we talked about before, we don't have blue going from the full left to right of the screen. We actually have these black bars on the sides. Those are actually because we've set 2 flags right next to Jennifer, kind of actually just off of her shoulders, just close enough to the screen that they don't actually block any of our foreground lighting. But what we're trying to do is twofold. We're doing, first off, trying to keep spill from the screen from wrapping around and causing any additional bounce on the edge of her jacket and on her face. That's going to help us control spill and keep a clean key on the edges. The second thing that it's doing is actually blocking as much blue as possible from reaching the taking lens of the main camera. By blocking this extra blue, we're helping to cut down the amount of flare that's inherent in any lens. Anytime you put a light source that's coming towards a lens, that lens is going to have a tendency to pick up some of that light scattered around within the barrel and ultimately contaminate your blacks with that color. In this case, if we had all blue, that blue may actually end up bleeding into the entire shadow section of our foreground, and it's going to make it a more difficult key. By flagging off as much blue as possible, we're minimizing that effect. The trick is we can't bring these flags too far in. You'll notice this one's in pretty tight because Jennifer doesn't move much to the side. But Jennifer, could you raise your binoculars? You'll notice that as she comes up, she actually now fills more of this void. We probably could sneak this one in a little bit more, but just in case her acting, she gets a little bit more boisterous and needs to lean forward, we want to give her enough room that she never crosses that line. What we'll do in post is garbage mat this out. We'll basically just take a really rough mat and cut right down the side there. When we cut that out, this all goes away. The challenge is if she were to happen to cross over into this black, her hand is either going to disappear if she goes behind the flag, or it's no longer going to be in front of a blue screen. So the keyer is not going to be able to cut a mat around that. Guess what? That's where you'll have to come in with rotoscope and manually, frame by frame, trace her hand every frame that it happens to be in front of that flag. Be careful that you don't actually let the character ever leave the blue area of the screen. So with all the foreground lights off, we're able to find out exactly how much spill we're getting. This is going to be actually fairly indicative of what our mat will actually look like after the key has been pulled. And you'll notice that we are getting a little bit of spill on her right edge of her face. The nice thing is the fatigues are actually a nice matte finish, so they're absorbing enough light that we're not really getting any spill there. We do have a little bit on her face. The nice thing, I know I've set a rim light for that side, so I'm not going to be too worried about it. When that rim light comes in, it's going to be more than enough to overpower this little bit of spill we're getting, so I'm not going to worry too much about trying to correct it. If I didn't have a kicker on that side and I was trying to get a nice hard edge like we have on this side, I'd need to set some additional flags and grippage to be able to keep that little bit of spill in control. This also shows you just how effective black can be. It's entirely appropriate to blue screen somebody in silhouette. The Macintosh ads are probably, the iPod ads are probably a classic example of using silhouette in a composite. But just as easily, this could be the shadow of somebody crossing in front of our same scene. It doesn't have to be lit. Your foreground object can just as easily be a shadow. Okay, so our first light is the small mini flow. It's doing two things. It's providing a fill source that allows me to get her overall exposure above the noise floor on the HVX. But it's also, more importantly, acting as an eye light. It's giving us just that little tiny spark in the eyes that allows an audience to understand what a character is going through in a scene. You find without those little sparks in the eye, the frame goes dead very quickly, and it's amazing how little you need to see in an eye light to be able to be effective. So our next light is this dado that's working off of her shoulder. This is directly motivated from the light that's closest to camera that's on the upper left-hand corner of the frame. We actually set this light fairly high, reaching over top of the shoulder, because we want to feel that it has enough intensity to be warranted from that light. The light that's over her left shoulder is closer to the camera than the other two, so we need to feel its intensity just ever so slightly brighter. When we initially set it, we actually had it faded back, which looked better to my eye aesthetically, but was less motivated by the scene. It's a judgment call on your part whether or not you want to go strictly true to the background or whether you want to make a creative decision to do something that's more aesthetically pleasing but may not be as accurate. Third light is the diva. This diva is acting as a rim light and also is the kicker that's helping us to control the spill we looked at earlier. This is basically bringing her cheek up and helping to separate her from the background. It's motivated by the two smaller lights that are further in the distance at the lower right of the frame. Because of their relative position lower in the frame, we've actually positioned the diva at a low angle coming up as a kicker as opposed to a straight side light. It does a nice job of wrapping around her face, and because this is essentially the key light in a sense, it's the brightest light that we have on her face. Because this diva is the brightest light on Jennifer's face, we wanted to make sure that it's a soft light. The dado on the backlight is nice for being able to get a very defined, focused beam. But But the diva on a face, we don't want to go too hard, especially on women's faces. It has a tendency to bring out the texture in flesh tones a little more than we'd like. So a diva or even a softer source works well. The fourth light we've set, you probably didn't notice much happen when I turned it on. This is actually a special that was placed specifically for the binoculars. So Jennifer, could you raise the binoculars up? You'll notice now that as the binoculars come into frame, they're getting just a tiny bit of light on the front edge of the lenses. Without this light, which was our initial setup, when we initially set up, we didn't have this light. And we noticed between the black gloves and the black binoculars that all you were left with was a giant black hole in the middle of the frame. We needed a little bit something to help bring the binoculars out of that shadow and let us know exactly what her activities are. Now this light is most likely going to need to be adjusted from take to take, because no matter how good Jennifer is at hitting her mark, you'll probably need to make slight adjustments to make sure that it's right on the mark. There's one other option that you have if you're shooting a night scene. That's actually to overlight with the intent of printing darker for the composite. Basically what we've done here is just to bring up an additional front light that's a pretty straight-on soft fill. That's basically brought her illumination level up to something that's more akin to what you'd see, midday. The challenge with this, when you print down, is you're going to have to increase the contrast to get your ratios back to where they need to be. As you print down, you're going to be pulling your highlights down the same as you're pulling your fill down, unless, as I said, you increase contrast. By increasing that contrast, though, you're also going to increase the noise. And ultimately, you're not going to end up with as clean a shot. If you can light it the way it should be lit initially, you're going to have cleaner results in the end. Good.
What you doing?
Just double checking.
Oh.
So we're pretty much 55 higher E and we're pretty straight. So that's good.
All right. Okay, so Jennifer, let's just go ahead and rehearse this real quick.
Okay.
Can you do the shot for me? Let's see what you're going to be doing.
Perimeter secure. Alpha team, you're a go for sector Charlie 7. Can I
Okay.
do it again?
No, it's okay. I understand. It's because
Yeah.
you already forgot the line a little bit. That's
Yeah.
fine. I got you. Let's just go ahead and try it again.
Okay. Is it okay, like, cause if I'm gonna come up, I'm gonna want to kind of like scan. I'm not just gonna like.
You did it
bam.
perfect.
Yeah, that looked
you
really
did
good.
perfect.
Okay.
That looked really good. Anybody has input on the action? Anything, David? Okay.
Think we're-
Go for it one more time.
Perimeter secure. Alpha team, you're a go for sector Charlie 7.
Beautiful. Let's go ahead and roll A-cam.
Camera speeds.
Stand by. And action.
Perimeter secure. Alpha team, you're a go for sector Charlie 7.
If you can keep your eye line a couple of degrees further to the right, don't come quite around as far forward when you finish scanning.
Okay. So let's do that one more time. And stand by. Roll A-cam.
A speeds.
And action.
Perimeter secure. Alpha team, you're a go for sector Charlie 7.
I liked it when it was panned a little bit more to the
Mhm.
left. Let's cut to A-cam.
Yeah.
When it was panned a little bit more to the left, when you kind of turned a little bit more to the left, because I could see both the barrels of the binoculars,
Yeah.
which was a little bit cooler. Let me see where your binoculars going to end up. Yeah, that's it right there. Yeah, that's cool. I like that much better. Stand by.
A speeds.
All right. And action.
Perimeter secure. Alpha team, you're a go for sector Charlie 7.
All right. Cut.
Good.
What do you think, David?
I like it.
Cool. Whenever you're ready,
Okay.
Camera
stand
speeds.
a little bit. Come back to me.
Incoming fire. You're 2 o'clock.
One more time. I liked it first better the first time because you're a little bit more frenzied.
Okay.
Cool. Stand by.
Camera speeds.
Thank you. Scan. Come back.
Incoming fire. You're 2 o'clock.
That was great. One more time as safety, and then we got it.
So to match our background practical lights, basically from a little swatch book I've pulled, it's actually a 1/8 plus blue and an 1/8 minus green, which is a magenta. And those mixed together give me kind of a lavender that to eye feels pretty close to what we're getting out of that one row of backlights. So we're going to set that for one side. We've got to set the blues for the other side. So she's saying something on your earpiece. That's where you look over to here. Come here, she has her line, you're clear to go in. Come up, and that's when you reveal yourself to the shooter. He starts shooting at you, she screams in your ear, you turn and pop a shot.
Okay.
So we'll set Chad's blocking and then we'll adjust from there. So go ahead and go for it. Go for sector 12. So then you'll roger that,
Roger that.
or whatever you do.
Moving in.
Roger that. Moving in.
And then stand up.
Hell is that? Oh.
I thought it was the radio. I thought somebody was.
walkie. I was like, no, there's somebody on the walkie.
That's okay.
All right.
Roger that. Moving in.
And stand up. You're taking fire. You're taking fire. Good. So it's think more. You're a marksman. You're badass. Right now, I feel like you're aiming like this. You're aiming all over the place.
All right.
Turn, lock. Yeah, find a spot. Pick one of those grommets, and you know
Go at one.
that's that asshole from high school that you really wanted to kill.
Just walk in right now.
Yeah, go ahead and try it. So you come in. You're
Roger
clear.
that.
Clear for sector 12.
Clear for sector 12.
And stand into it. You're taking fire, taking fire. Good. So Tyler, let me see you on your end mark, because that's going to set.
You want me
He
pretty much
doesn't have
square
an
with
end
him
point
right
yet.
behind him?
Yeah, you're going to be pretty much right in.
Do you want me
In
to
pretty
do you
tight.
wanna mark him?
Yeah, definitely.
A marker for Tyler.
That's good.
Where do you want Tyler? Just end mark.
Let me see him step in. A little too far. Back out just a little bit. That's good. Right there.
Right there.
Okay, Chad, could I see you back on your mark, please? And actually, Tyler, too.
You need a C-stand over here, or can it move?
Which one?
The C-stand right here in front of Chad.
No, that can go.
Okay, thanks. Okay, guys, hold steady for him so you can do the lighting on you. What are you doing there, David?
So right now we're setting the rim that is motivated off of the blue metal halide lights that are in the background on the other side of the fence. We've already set kind of a purplish magenta for the reverse rim. So it's really just trying to motivate those colors and start feeling that that vibe on their faces a bit.
Do you want to kill also the select?
Yeah, please. All right, Chad, let me see your eye line when you're. So I come around a little bit more rimish on that one. That's actually not too bad. Sorry. And Tyler, let me see on your mark, or is that pretty much you on it? Good. And now can I have you off to the, looking at your mark again? Up. Good. So I get a little bit more pink in that room. And we'll be ready to go. So not quite as noodly or careful as we were last time, but it still works.
Yeah. Because we're running out of time.
This is real world. This is what happens. You basically run up against your deadline. You got to be off the stage. So what do? You make it work. All right. When we set an 1/8 minus green, which is a magenta gel, and it just wasn't giving us enough pink to match those backlights. And nothing says tough marine like pink light. So we just added another 3/4 magenta to, excuse me, another 3/4 magenta to go full. Good, it's working. You want me on mark?
Yeah.
So if we can bring on the, bring up our screen and we're good to go.
All right. Okay, so what we're gonna do is you guys are gonna just be in your position. It's your mark. Just put your, the gun in your chest with the walkie against your mouth. And
Pre-bend.
no, just get in your final mark. This is just for turning on the light. Stand by. Camera's rolling. Go for the backgrounds.
So what we've done, if you don't have a waveform monitor, what you can actually do is turn on your zebra and set it to an internal zebra of 55, which in the HVX is the lowest it'll go. And that actually gives you the ability, by adjusting your exposure, to see kind of where your hot spots are. You can see that the bottom is a little hot, but then the rest of it's actually coming up pretty much at the same time. So the hottest spot's right there. If we had the time or the inclination, we could go in and use some grippage to dial that back. But it's really not bad. It's all coming up really within about 1/8 of a stop, which is what we're looking for. So you can see we've got pretty even coverage through the whole screen. It's good enough to shoot.
What's your interpretation of the scopes? I mean, does that look even to you, or what is it?
So basically what we're looking for with the scopes is to try and see whether or not our ratio, the keyer that we're using likes to see right around between a 50 and a 60 IRE on the blue screen. So this thicker bar that you're seeing right through the middle is actually the blue of the blue screen. Chad, would you walk to your right just a little bit? You can see that shadow crossing in front of the screen. That actually is the representation of Chad's black. That's why he's down lower on the bar. And then if you walk back the other way. So as he comes across, you can see what we're looking for is that the illumination on the screen is a perfectly horizontal line. We want that as smooth as possible. That tells us that we're evenly lit. Cool. Thanks.
Sweet. Thanks, Chad.
Okay, camera set.
All right, David, why don't you go ahead and just do the action on this one yourself. Just direct these guys.
Camera speed. So actually, Chad, can you start just one step further back? And Tyler, if you can just suck right up against that light just for the very beginning, that's good. Okay. Camera speeds and action.
I'm moving in.
Clear sector 12.
Clear sector 12.
Taking fire. Taking fire. Good. So for I'll say I'm actually the clear sector 12 is her line.
Okay.
So just listen to that. Acknowledge that's her coming over the radio, answering your question. So yeah, you're clear to go in. That's when you stand up. Oh, okay, it's clear. She just told me I'm covered. It's all good. As soon as you stand up, that's when you start taking fire from back there. Turn. Be confident about it. Lock and pop. If you don't mind, I'm just going to pass this right up.
No worries.
And odd as it is, we're going to come out your armpit.
Ooh.
Good.
That's gonna pick me up over here?
Yep.
No way.
It's nice and sensitive. It's also nice and backwards right now, so give it 1 second. Good. Thanks.
That is cool.
Armpit check once. Sure.
Yeah, actually, you're sounding pretty damn good.
All right, so we'll do one action without the flashes, and then we'll do one more action with the flashes, so I can get the background on this one.
Good. That's where she is. So when I say clear sector 12, that's that red X talking to you.
Okay.
And then you're like, okay, I'm clear, so you stand up. You're thinking that, you don't say it. You stand up, and that's when taking fire, duck back down, level, and pop one.
You want us to do it right now? You take it?
Yeah, go for it. Why not?
We're moving in.
You're clear, sector 12. Fire, taking fire. Good. Nice.
Okay.
So, yeah, and what's the fastest you can do on the strobe? It's about,
Like this.
yeah.
Sometimes it does a double, just by
Which
itself.
actually could be good.
Yeah.
Because that's, okay. When you fire, recoil.
Yeah. Do the recoil into your elbow, like it's shooting back at you.
Yeah,
you know?
just a little bit, subtle.
Yeah, subtle.
Good.
And stand by.
Camera speeds. Action.
We're moving in.
Copy sector 12. Fire. Good. Two hand. So when I say fire, oh yeah, you got, that's what it is. You know what? I can't tell that you don't have an earpiece in the other ear.
Okay.
So let's lose that and just go to an earpiece.
Yeah, just throw it inside that bag. Yeah, that's fine.
That's what's throwing you off. So yeah, exactly.
Let's keep my finger over here.
Yep.
Yeah, keep the finger until you're ready to fire, like when he said. Do two hands.
And then once you come in, two-hand, lock it, and then pop one off. Pick a target and actually aim for it. I mean, really find something over there that you're going to go for, and truly try and hit it with your.
Contain your movements a
round.
little bit. Don't make them too random. Just kind of slow down your movements a little bit. Okay.
Camera speeds, and action.
We're moving in.
Clear sector 12. Taking fire. Fire. That's alright. You're wild busting it. There you go. Camera speeds. And action.
We're moving in.
Clear sector 5. Fire. That was pretty good.
Yeah. Let's just do it one more time, maybe with like a couple more blasts.
Mhm.
Maybe 3 blasts instead of just 1. How about that? Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right. Let's do one with 3 blasts. Poof, poof, poof. Like you can count it in your mind. Pow.
Tyler, have you been starting high at the beginning when you walk in? Okay, good.
Is he a little loud when he comes in? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we'll be alright. Because I'm thinking you'll probably crop in on it just a little bit.
Check 1, 2.
That's good, Pitt?
Can you give me on the side?
A little bit, not as much. Camera speeds. And action.
We're moving in.
Clear sector 12. Fire.
Much better,
Yeah,
except
that's
for
good.
that cell phone. Is there a way to turn that damn thing off?
I thought I did.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So I think one more just like that. I don't have any tweaks. Tyler, you're doing a great job. It's looking good.
Yeah.
Camera speeds. Action.
We're moving in.
It's clear sector 12. Fire. Good.
Perfect. And point your guns at me. Stand by.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay,
That's
cool.
really
Yeah.
looks great. Camera speeds. Action.
We're moving in.
Clear sector 12. Taking fire, taking fire. Camera speeds and action.
We're moving in.
Clear sector 12. Taking fire. Nice.
That look good?
Yep.
Let's do-
My name is David Smith. I'm a director of photography. Today we're going to talk a little bit about chroma keying or compositing and the issues that you should be concerned with when doing a green screen shoot. The size and color of your screen, how to properly light the screen itself, and also how to properly light your foreground oxygen. We'll also get a little bit into compositing software and the types of things you should be looking for in a good keyer. One little tip I wanted to give you before we start is about my favorite tool on set that most people aren't really aware of. That's something called the tablet PC. A tablet PC is a standard laptop that has the ability to swivel its screen around sideways so that you can actually write directly on the screen with a digitizing pen. In the case of set use, I'll actually bring my scripts in and I can actually write notes and take diagrams directly on the script, but especially here I'm able to actually do a lighting diagram on set while we're working that's a living active document. So today we've kind of started with the green screen setup we have behind us, illustrating where all of my what type of instruments I have, where they're positioned on set, and most importantly, what color temperature those lights are working from, so that later on, if I have to come back and duplicate the setup, I have a record of all my different sets over the years are all present in the system. So I always have a reference to go back to. If there's a particular look that I remember liking from a past project, I can go back and figure out exactly how did I achieve that to apply it to the day. So tablet PC, something I highly recommend if you ever get a chance to buy a new laptop. Add another $120 to $200 to the price of a regular laptop and you can get that same laptop in a tablet PC configuration. It's well worth it. It's a really great tool. So this is a diagram of essentially just the screen lighting that we've done so far on our green screen. So the first thing I'll want to do is actually make a representation of the screen itself, including a color bar that tells me what color screen I was using. In this case, we're doing a green screen. And then I'll just do simple representations of your lights. A lot of people have their own symbols for different lights. Pretty much you want to use a symbol that's representative of the light that's going to be readable to someone else in case you ever have to actually print this out and hand it off to your gaffer or hand it off to production. So make it a symbol that's meaningful. In this case, we've got our two image 80s that are overhead lighting the majority of our screen. Because the image 80 is basically a giant square fixture, I'll actually pull off a separate label that tells me what that light is. We then have two 4x4 Kino soft banks those are actually working as side fill. So I actually, because they're in a vertical position, I'll draw a diagram that tells me that by looking at the end of the 4 globes. And then we also have a single 4x that's underneath. So all those will be labeled. And then based on a color key, in this case I'm using the magenta color to indicate our 3200 Kelvin tubes that are in these particular instruments. Because we're going to be doing a daylight scene, I'll actually now have room to add my foreground lighting fixtures. Those fixtures I'll actually shade with our 5600 blue, so that I'll know later on exactly what color temperature those particular globes were. So that's a simple idea. There's also, if you go online, there's plenty of resources for drafting use, where you can actually find out specific symbols that are more appropriate for every type of light out there, whether it be a 10K Fresnel or a soft light. You'll be able to find symbols that are meaningful for all those. Or if you're only planning to use the diagrams yourself, just come up with something that's easy for you to remember. The most important consideration when lighting a green screen is to make sure that the lighting level on the screen is as even as possible given your production scenario. Obviously it's impossible to make it perfect. If you had all the lights in the world and all the time in the world, I'm sure you could, but none of us ever face that in real world production. So your job really is to make it as good as possible so that when you get into post you're having to spend the least amount of time cleaning up after yourself, or worse yet, having somebody else clean up after you. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the techniques for how to get a proper stretch out of your screen, how to hang a screen so that you're making your life easier, not harder, and then we'll get into how to light that screen for an even illumination. The green screen that you see behind me is a 12x12 screen that we've hung actually without a frame. It's just hung loose from a grid here in the studio. Pretty much all we're doing for the stretch is to tie it evenly across the top, horizontal to the floor, and actually first apply a little bit of stretch there. So when you're tying it, you want to actually tie your ropes off to the sides, not straight up. If you go straight up, you'll actually get waves in the middle of it, and you'll already start with wrinkles right off the bat. So by stretching to the sides, you're actually able to get a stretch across the top. Then at the bottom, we're using a series of sandbags, and in one case a C-stand where we had a problem area, to then apply just enough stretch to all 4 corners to be able to get the majority of the large wrinkles out of the screen. By pulling the bottom of the screen slightly forward towards the camera, giving the screen a little bit of a backward pitch, you're going to help yourself out in a couple of areas. That little bit of a pitch is going to force gravity to pull on the middle of the screen just a little bit. That pull will actually help get some of the fine wrinkles out of the screen if you don't have a spandex or a screen that has enough stretch to actually remove those wrinkles on its own. This angle also helps because your primary lighting source for the screen is actually going to be an overhead soft light. That soft light, if it's directly overhead, is going to create a gradient on the screen because you're too close. By moving it away and angling the screen into the light, you're able to get an equal distance across the majority of the screen to that fixture, which means your lighting is going to be much more even. If you have too much of not enough of an angle, or your light is too close to the screen, you're going to get a lot more light on the top and a lot less light on the bottom. That's going to force you to bring more instruments in to try and bring the bottom up, and it makes life a lot more difficult. We did actually make use of that trick here as well, where we have 2 lights that are to either side of the screen and at a lower angle to be able to fill in some of the shadows from some of the wrinkles we couldn't get out with a stretch. And we also have a little kicker that's just a single globe Kino that's working as a ground row light underneath the screen to help fill in the one gap area which almost always occurs, which is the center bottom of the screen. With those 6 lights, we're with those 5 lights, I guess it is. With those 5 lights, we're actually able to get a nice even illumination on the screen. Your eye is actually a very poor judge of illumination on a large flat surface like a green screen, because your eye constantly readjusts as you change your gaze. You need something that's going to be more objective and actually give you a true readout. There's basically 3 tools for this. The first one would be a vector scope and waveform monitor, specifically the waveform monitor. That's what we have here and here. And we also have probably one of the more common things you've seen on set, which is a spot meter. In this case, it's a combination spot meter and incident meter, but you want to make sure you're using a spot meter for a screen because you need to actually measure the amount of light that's reflecting off of the screen, where the incident meter is only going to tell you how much light is falling on the screen and doesn't take the properties of the screen into effect. A spot meter is incredibly helpful and is actually the single best way to be able to judge exposure across the screen as you move from zone to zone. In this case, I have a spot meter that actually has a readout in the display not only on the front but also in the eyepiece. This is really helpful so that you don't have to keep pulling the meter away from your eye to be able to check your readings. You can just hold the button down and scan in a serpentine pattern across the entire screen and see exactly where you stand. If you happen to have one that doesn't have this feature, you're going to have to take a reading, look at it, remember where you were, take another reading and look at it again. It's just a little bit more time consuming. So let's take a scan of the screen that we have now, and you'll see that we're essentially within about 2 or 3/10 of a stop across almost all of the screen. So all I'm doing is scanning from left to right, making small movements down so that I know that as I'm moving across, I'm covering the entire screen. Otherwise, you can do kind of more of a haphazard approach, but you may miss a spot. The serpentine pattern seems to work well. Here we're going to take my meter and put it into incident mode now, which is actually going to measure the amount of light that's falling on the screen. In this case, we have our blue screen that is less than ideal. It actually has 2 shades of blue on the same screen for some unknown and bizarre reason. What we're going to show is that actually with the incident meter, the light level hitting the screen is exactly the same, but the camera gets quite a different picture based on the reflectivity and the color of the screen itself. So if we take a meter reading here against the dark blue, you'll see that we're basically at about a 28.8, and as we move down to the light blue, we're still at a 2.8, which is to be expected since the same amount of light is hitting both parts of the screen. But you can see based on the camera that those 2 screens are quite a bit different. This is where a spot meter or using your zebras or a waveform monitor is critical. You need to be measuring the amount of light returning to the camera from the surface, not the amount of light hitting the surface itself. If you measure the amount of light hitting the surface, you're ignoring what qualities that surface might have. It could be that your screen is reflective. If you're using a spandex screen that has too much spandex in it, it can actually create hot spots because of its reflectivity. Or in this case, we have a screen that's been dyed 2 different colors. So by all means, try not to use your incident meter when you're trying to balance the light on your green or blue screen. To help you understand what a screen might look like if it's improperly lit, we've turned both of our side lights and our bottom kicker off to make only the top 2 image 80s illuminate the screen. This is going to give us a hot spot in the center top of the screen, letting the rest of the screen fall off to darkness. So you can tell as I'm moving the meter across the screen, again in a serpentine fashion, almost think like you're a search and rescue team trying to make sure that you don't leave any areas uncovered. You'll notice that the display is actually ranging pretty much from about a 2.8.4 all the way up through a little over a 4. So we're actually getting a little bit more than a stop difference from the sides to the center of our screen. This is actually still not terrible. If you had a much spottier light as your top source, say a Fresnel, you'd find that you'd have anywhere upwards of a 2-stop difference in fall off from your hotspot to the remainder of the screen. So what you're looking for is to try and get that within about a 1/3 of a stop difference across the portion of the screen that you know your foreground is going to interact with. That's what you're looking for. The last item, which most everybody has on their prosumer or professional cameras, that I actually prefer to use because it gives me a snapshot of the entire screen, is actually your zebra control. Zebras are a measure of exposure that's built into the camera that gives you a pattern that tells you when you've reached a certain exposure level. Whether or not your camera has the ability to adjust the point at which the zebra kicks in, for instance, the HVX allows you to bring your zebras all the way down to 55 IRE, which in the case of green screen is actually where I like to put my screen level, is between 50 and 60 IRE, so that works perfectly. But even if you have a camera that only allows you to have 100 IRE zebras, by irising down, you can actually still make use of those, actually I should say stopping down or irising up. You can still make use of those zebras because all you're looking for is to see when those zebras kick on. That's going to show you where your hot spots are. The first place the screen starts to show you the zebra, you have a little bit too much light there. And as you open up your lens more, you'll start seeing the zebra fill in the screen in the order of from lightest to darkest that your screen is illuminated. It's a great way to be able to judge exactly where the hot spots are so you can then come in and either flag it off, turn a couple of globes off, or start removing light. So if we're looking at exposure levels on your green screen, the Zebra is a great tool to have that almost all professional and semi-pro cameras these days have. The Zebra gives you the ability to judge exposure as it reaches the lens. In this case, we're going to look at this particular green screen, which isn't 100% perfect, but rarely will you have a screen that is, but it's good enough to get a really clean key, and we'll show you why. So looking at the screen, as you adjust your exposure, you'll start to see your zebras kick in at the first place that you have a hot spot. In this case, our first spot is actually showing up in the lower right of screen, but the next gradation we have, almost the entire screen goes to zebra. That's telling us that actually the zebras are all kicking in at the same point, which means that we have a fairly even illumination. Now you may have noticed that the corners of the screen aren't kicking in yet. If we move just a little bit further up, you'll see that they fill in within about a half a stop worth of adjustment. We start at the 5.6, right at the point we drop to 4.8. We're seeing most of the screen fill in. The remainder of the screen fills in really before we even get to that 4. So it's within a half a stop difference, which is pretty good. What you're going to look for with this, though, is making sure that the area that does fill in first and that fills in the most evenly is the area that's surrounding where the edges of your foreground subject will be. In this case, we know that it's just going to be a single individual in front of the screen who's going to be taking up the center portion of the screen. Her actions really won't carry her into the corners of the screen, so there's really no point in me wasting production time and ultimately my client's money by trying to get the corners of the screen perfect when I know I don't need to use those. Those will be garbage matted out. In fact, for the most part, I'll actually be bringing in flare control flags that are going to block those corners from the camera completely. So I'm not too worried about the fact that I don't have those corners lit yet. If I was shooting, say, a crowd scene or somebody running across the screen where I would have that foreground object crossing into those corners, it becomes worth it for me to be able to then bring additional light in or to add additional light control to my existing light to try and smooth out those corners. But in this situation, we don't have to. I considered our job to be able to work as efficiently as possible by knowing what we need to do and what we can get away with. In this case, we can get away with not having those corners perfect. Your first hotspot's going to show up as zebraing first, which in this case we're seeing just a little bit at the bottom right and a little bit at the top of the screen. As we start advancing, the very next stop when we come up to a 4.8, almost the entire screen pops in at once. It's a good sign. That means that most of our screen is evenly lit. You can see that our corners are still a little dark, but they actually come into play before we get to that 4, so we're actually still within a half stop difference across our whole screen, which is in most cases really pretty good. To help you understand what lighting may look like if it's not done properly, we've actually turned off some of our screen lights to show you what uneven illumination is going to look like on your zebras. In this case, we basically turned off the 2 side fills, which is giving us a really, really big hot spot at the top center of our screen from our 2 overhead image 80s. As I open the iris, you'll start to see the zebras kick in pretty quickly right at that upper hot spot. And you can see I actually have to go through a fair range, in this case almost 2 whole stops, before I can get the entire screen covered in zebras. There I'm wide open and I still have my lower right still isn't covered. So this is where having additional lighting instruments available to you to be able to bring side fill in is critically important. Side fill also does something else for the screen. If you have wrinkles, by bringing in side fill, you're actually able to light both facets of the wrinkle, making it less noticeable to the camera. So by all means, top light, side light, and in some cases bottom light. You want to try and surround the screen with as much soft light as possible. It's another trick that I want to mention. A lot of people try to start with a base exposure and then bring more light in to be able to even out their screen. I find that oftentimes that's a lot more time consuming and a lot more difficult. I'll usually try and bring in more light than I know I'm going to need. I'll know it's going to be uneven and then slowly start removing light to even the screen out. It's a lot faster to turn a globe off than it is to have somebody set a new instrument. So I'm able to slowly back the light down as I need it to be able to balance it out as I'm looking at either my zebras, my waveform monitor, or measuring with my spot meter. Okay, when setting up a waveform monitor, you're going to want to make sure that your camera is feeding bars, as my HVX is now. And we're actually, if you have a well-calibrated monitor, you may be able to just put it in your calibrated settings, and 9 times out of 10 that's going to be correct. My scopes have been around for a while and actually are not in ideal calibration, so I'm actually going to switch to a variable calibration mode where I can tweak it and make sure that everything is as it should be. So the first adjustment you want to make, we're going to set our filter to LPass, an internal reference. That way we have the scopes pulling its own reference and feeding us the display that's going to show us the bars in the most meaningful way. Our gain control actually sets what the vertical scale of the signal is. We actually want to adjust between our scale and our vertical offset to be able to make sure that our white chip is showing at 100 IRE and that our pluged bars, the 3 small black bars at the bottom, are actually reading at the 7.5 and 0 IRE, I'm sorry, at 10, 7.5, and 0.5 IRE respectively. So what you'll want to do is kind of work these 2 controls off of each other until all 3 of those chips line up properly, including your 100 IRE at the top. Once you have that set, you can adjust your horizontal to be able to see the full spectrum of both of your odd and even fields. And then you're going to set your intensity of both the display itself and your scale display to make sure that you're able to read accurately as much information as you need, and then also focus just to make sure that you're seeing things crisp. Once you've got that set, you can start to make qualitative judgments off of the display. So we'll switch the camera off of bars and take a look at what our blue screen looks like compared to now a known calibrated scale. Okay, so now that we have our scope set to bars, we want to make sure not to make any adjustments from here to the controls, since that now is set up properly. Any adjustments we make is going to force us to go back to bars and recalibrate. What we're looking at now is the output of the camera as we look at the full width of the green screen. And now again, as I mentioned, this screen is good enough to get a good key. It's not perfect. If you remember, we had the corners were showing a little bit dark. That's displayed as a broadening of the color band on your waveform monitor. You can see the center portion, which is the portion we care about, the portion that our foreground actor is going to be covering, is actually a perfectly horizontal and even line. That's actually a very narrow line. The more narrow the line, the closer your tolerance of exposure levels within the color band are. As we start getting into the corners, those corners will be displayed as a widening of that band. So your goal is to get as sharp and as horizontal a line from left to right across your screen as possible. So you'll notice that as we move across the display, which is actually showing a true representation of the left to right orientation of our actual image, that on the left and right edges we're starting to see a broadening of the band. This is actually because the corners of our screen aren't lit as evenly as the middle. In the corners it goes a little dark. Well, that darkening is represented as an opening of the band, which you're seeing here as we start getting kind of a triangular shape appearing. What you want to try and go for with even illumination is as straight and as narrow a line as possible, like we have in the middle of our screen. In our case, we're only going to be shooting the middle of the screen because we only have a single actor, so that's our area of most critical concern. That's the area that I want to make sure is nice and is flat and as sharp as possible. And now what the waveform monitor is actually representing is essentially a bar graph of the exposure across your entire frame. In this case, you're seeing the odd fields on the left, the even fields on the right. So if you only look at half of this, you're actually seeing a true representation of the far left and far right of your image. So if you were to imagine the image flipped on its side and a bar graph of the brightness, almost think like mountain peaks, the brightness of the illumination across that screen, that's what's actually being showed on your bar graph. From 0 IRE, which is actually what our sync line is showing us here at the bottom, all the way up to 100 and actually up to 120 IRE, another 20 degrees above 100. So that bar graph is actually showing us the relative exposure across the width of our frame. Now the waveform monitor is actually a bar graph showing us our relative illuminance levels across the width of our frame. We have an odd field and an even field, so what you're looking at is actually only half of the display is going to show you the full width from left to right of your image. So your waveform monitor is actually showing essentially a bar graph of relative illuminance levels based on a single volt of your video signal. It's measured in IREs, which is the Institute of Radio Engineer unit of measure, from 0, which is actually your brightest point, to 1 volt, which is actually black. In the case of IREs, you're going from 0 black to 100, and in some cases you can actually get to 100 to 120 IREs. Basically, the 0 IRE is the point at which you have no detail in your black, and 100 IRE or above is where you have no detail in your white. So you essentially have your entire grayscale represented from 0 to 100, 0 being your deepest black, 100 being your brightest white. And then in between you have all of your different shades of gray and of various illuminations of different tones and different colors. In general, you're going to, with most, say, portrait style exposure, you're going to find that Caucasian skin will fall typically between 50 and 60 IRE, some cases as bright as 70. Darker complexions will be between 40 and 50 IRE. For the most part, for most keying software, you're going to want to light your screen to be right in the 50 to 60 IRE range. In this case, with our lighting setup today, we're almost perfectly on our 50 IRE line, which is a great place to be. Some keyers like to see it a little bit hotter, some keyers like to see it a little bit darker. What you're looking for, though, is to create a nice even exposure that gives the most amount of chroma information possible. Now, chroma is actually measured on the vector scope, which is our next scope over to the left. A vector scope shows a slightly different version of your video signal. What you're actually looking at, where your waveform monitor showed you your relative luminance levels, or the brightness, you're actually looking at your chroma levels, or the color saturation, in the vector scope. We've switched back to bars to help you see what the display, the circle is actually showing you. You essentially have a series of targets as you work your way around the vector scope display. Each of those targets represents one of the colors of the color bar display or the color bar test pattern. In this case, we're looking at red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and the way over here is yellow. Now when we switch back over to the green screen, we're going to notice that this green material that we're using, which is actually a Rosco DigiGreen, has a large component of yellow in it. The standard Rosco green will fall very close to your actual green target. In this case, the DigiGreen is actually giving us a little bit more yellow in an attempt to give us more reflectivity so that we get a brighter luminance value at a still saturated color, although it's not pure green. The nice thing is today's keyers don't require an actual primary color. They really only care that it's a consistent color and a consistent chroma value. Now, just like when we were setting up our waveform monitor, the vector scope needs to look at bars to be able to adjust its display to the signal coming from your camera. So similarly, if you have a well-calibrated monitor, you can go in calibrate mode, or you can switch to variable if you need to make some adjustments. So you have a variable gain control, similar to the luminance control that you had on your waveform monitor. In this case, we want to have all of our targets line up in their center crosshairs for each of their relative targets. And you want to adjust the phase so that all of your targets appear in their proper placement. There is an easy way to get off is actually to be 180 degrees out of phase. You'll notice that most of the targets line up just fine. The difference is that your little Y pattern here, which is actually part of your sync signal, is only showing, it basically opens to the left. You always want your Y to be opening to the right, and those actually will line up better on your I and Q to be able to show you that you're actually not 180 degrees out of phase. For the most part, if you're only using this to set up your green screen, even if you are 180 degrees out of phase, you're still going to get useful information from the scope. It's not critical to be correct on this point, but it's a point of accuracy. Now, as we're adjusting our luminance level on our waveform monitor, you'll notice that the change in the vector scope, as I brighten, as I iris down and iris up, you'll actually see my target adjusting. This target actually represents the green that the camera is seeing. In our case, it's the green screen. And you'll notice that it's not quite in line with our solid green target. Because this is a DigiGreen screen, it has a large component of yellow in it, which helps it have a much higher reflectivity, so we get a lot more exposure out of the same screen with the same amount of light. Most keyers are able to tolerate this difference in color quite easily, and especially since flesh tones tend to have more red in them than yellow, it really doesn't affect the key too much, but it does give us a much brighter screen under the same amount of illumination. Now, as I adjust the iris, you'll notice that if I get too far and overexpose, my color starts to drift even more into that yellow. That's where you actually want to avoid overexposure in your screen, and likewise where you want to avoid cranking the chroma value too much in camera, which I personally don't think you should adjust at all. If you increase the chroma too much, you'll actually get clipping, which will cause not only a shift towards yellow, it'll actually broaden out and go between yellow and more towards cyan, as the CCD tries to adjust for the fact that it can no longer handle the overvoltage. What you're looking for as we adjust back to about our 50 to 60 IRE is that we're getting a nice healthy amount of chroma information. If you were too underexposed, you can see you'd start going towards black and you at a certain point actually lose all chroma altogether. So what you're looking for is just a nice healthy mid-ground where your chroma information is giving you a full-bodied signal that's not subject to any noise from being too low or subject to clipping from being too high. So as we increase the saturation artificially in the camera, you'll notice that your display starts to spread out to more of a line than a sharp point. That line is actually indicating that the camera is starting to represent that green color as more of a variety of shades of green, slipping towards yellow and slipping towards cyan, as it's trying to deal with the artificial enhancement and in this case the increase in the green gain of turning up your chroma. You're now forcing the keyer to follow more than one color at the same time, which is not going to do well, and you're going to ultimately end up with a less than ideal key. Another trick that most people only think of for exterior photography, but that's actually quite helpful in the green screen stage, is the use of a polarizer. A polarizing filter allows you to control the amount of reflections you're getting off of shiny objects. Say you're shooting a car commercial or a piece of electronics that happen to have a shiny black surface on it. It's very easy for that shine to actually reflect the green of the green screen back to the camera. When you try and key that out, you're actually going to see your background plate bleeding through on the object surface, which is something you don't want. A polarizer, in this case we have a 4x4, would go in the rotating stage of your matte box. You'll need to make an adjustment to your exposure to account for the fact that a polarizer does absorb, depending on the brand, anywhere from a half a stop to 2 stops worth of light. But as you rotate that polarizer, you're actually going to see those reflections become less prominent and in some cases disappear completely. So with a polarizer, as we rotate it, you'll notice that the floor, in our case it's actually a shiny black dance floor, is really reflecting a lot of the green screen. As we start rotating the polarizer, that reflection is minimized and we can tell that the floor actually is black. You'll see that we can't get rid of 100% of it, but it's certainly a far cry better than it was originally. You can also use dulling spray to be able to take some reflections off of, say, shiny objects like the metal of a C-stand if we happen to be shooting a C-stand in front of a green screen. These two techniques are going to help, but ultimately you want to try and deal with materials that are as matte finished as possible. In general, reflections are very difficult when doing green screen work. One trick from the car industry, shooting cars in front of green screen is notoriously difficult. There's something called peel paint that was invented to actually allow you to paint an entire car either black or white. You actually paint the windows, the entire body of the car, in a matte black rubber paint that then is actually able to be peeled off after the fact. This is only useful really if you're using motion control photography though, because what you'll do is actually shoot a clean pass of the car for the beauty shot, then come back and shoot your matte pass using the peel paint to actually physically paint the car black. Right now we're actually going to relamp the foreground globes to 2900s to better match our overall key for our day exterior. So I'm cutting a couple of skins of opal. This diffusion is basically going to give me a little bit softer light on my foreground subject. Since especially we're having a cloudy day in our background scene, so we don't want too hard a beam from our sunlight. So the paragreens are going to give us more than enough quantity of light. The diffusion is just going to help us change the quality of that light a little bit so that it better matches our background plate. We've been shooting all day, so we have a few extra lights from previous setups. So right now I'm just kind of clearing out some of the stuff that we're not going to need and trying to rough in where I'm going to want my the lamps that I'm figuring I'm going to use for my new composite. In this case, we're using 2 parabeams lamped with 2900 globes that we're going to be using to create an overall ambient feel similar to the sunlight. It's a pretty punchy source. It's still soft. It's a broad 4-foot by 4-foot source, so it still gives a soft quality of light, but it's got a lot of punch and throw, so it's going to match our sunlight nicely. It's an overcast day, so that's why I've put opal in front of the lamps to take some of the edge off of that punchiness, help spread the light around a little bit more. And I'm also using 2 parabeams, one that's going to be a 3/4 front on Jennifer's left side and a 3/4 right on Jennifer's left side as well, or a 3/4 rear. So I'm actually allowing the parabeam's light to wrap completely around the key side. Then I'm going to bring a small dado in that I'm probably going to lamp a little bit cooler than our 2900 globes. That cooler light's going to be just a little bit of ambient fill. What I tend to find is that with daylight you have 2 competing colors. It's actually more of a mixed source situation. Your primary sunlight, which is going to actually play as slightly warmer than the bounce that's coming from the ambient sky. In this case it's an overcast day, so I don't have a pure blue sky, so my range of that mixed color is fairly narrow. I'm going to keep it pretty close, but I do want to feel a little bit of a cool side and warm side on her face. Now, one other piece of the puzzle, because we're shooting in an exterior location, not a black studio within our composite, we need to create the feeling of the environment, the radiosity that comes from the ground, from the trees, from things that are around Jennifer when she's actually laid into the composite. Nothing's more strong a giveaway to the fact that you're doing a key than if your contrast ratios in the foreground are vastly different than the contrast in the background. In this case, I'm just using a 4x4 scrim gem, the shiny white side of a silver lame, to create a nice even bounce that I'm going to bring in from underneath, from the ground, to kind of mimic the feel of whatever foreground foliage and sand and whatever else might happen to be in the location from our background plate. Next, I'd like to show you a handy tool to have on set. It's called the Ultimatte DV. It's a hardware keyer that's very simple to use and gives you a pretty decent job of being able to preview your composite live on set. It allows you to bring any source, whether it be S-video, DV, or composite video, in as a background and a camera feed as a foreground. And then it has a built-in keyer to allow you to do a preview of your key. Now in this case we have Jennifer, this time in her civilian clothes, in front of the green screen. And you can see that we basically have a frame where we're going to have a lot of garbage matting to be done, but all that we care about is that there's plenty of green around our foreground object. Now as I rotate through the settings, you'll see that I can actually completely lose that green background. Now as I go through, this is actually a preview of the mat itself. Internal to the keyer, this is what we're actually, our cookie cutout, if you will. Everything that's black is what the keyer is seeing as from our green screen and cutting out as a transparency. Anything that's white is opaque and is our foreground that will be allowed to remain in the frame. So our background will show where it's black, our foreground remains where it's white. Okay, with the Ultimatte DV's fairly straightforward, simple controls, we can take this green screen shot and start to look at what the mat's going to look like. So I'll switch my output to the matte mode. This is actually showing me the internal signal that's being generated by the Ultimatte as it's interpreting our background. So by adjusting my transparency controls, I'll start by taking my, my whites and making sure that my foreground stays as crisp white as I can while bleeding as much out as possible. Now if you'll notice, as I start dialing my whites back, some of the shadow areas in Jennifer's neck and chest start to go transparent. We start seeing some grays in there. So I want to dial that back to let her remain as solid as possible. And then we'll adjust our black levels, or our dark levels, until we start seeing similarly as clean of a screen around her as we can without losing some of those areas of the chest. With spill control, I can even dial this a bit further and start working to get as much of that background as solid black as possible without contaminating the white of our foreground. And lastly, I'm going to use the cleanup function to work into some of the areas where our green screen hasn't, remember if you recall from earlier, we still had some dark corners. So these dark corners are what's showing up as a difficult area for the keyer to maintain. Cleanup is actually a way of creating a softening function within the alpha channel that also helps us spread some of that black out. And it's really just a matter of balancing these different controls against one another to be able to maintain the cleanest key possible. You'll notice that this key is actually providing a fairly noisy signal. This is because we're only using the S-video output from these cameras. It's a standard definition output, and it is an analog output that is subject to a certain amount of noise. In this case, the Ultimatte is going to be used as a reference tool. We're not going to actually be generating final keys with it. When we bring the high definition full footage into our nonlinear editing system and then into our compositing system, that's going to be a much cleaner signal. So the fact that we have some noise here is normal and is something you shouldn't be concerned with. Basically all we're looking at for this is just to get a really rough idea on set, live in the moment, of what our composite might look like. So when we switch from our matte mode now to our freeze with our background, you can see that we actually have a fair amount of noise still on the green screen, but what we're most concerned with is that our edge around our foreground object is fairly clean and is fairly accurate. One challenge, because we are using soft sources and in particular bounce in this case, is that not only is the light that I like bouncing back, but also some of the return from the green screen. So what we're left with, even though the key is clean, we're left with a certain green hue that's being ascribed into the shadows of our foreground object. The Ultimatte does have a control for this. You can adjust the dark of your spill compensation circuit. The dark areas, you can dial in more compensation, which will slowly remove the green. Now you can overdo it and go so far that that will actually eventually start turning magenta. Obviously this is something you would only want to do for, say, a particular special effect. But for the most part, what it allows you to do is to dial out the green tint that will appear in your shadows, allowing you to achieve a more natural color cast so that the person who may be previewing this, say it's a client who might not understand that that will be removed later on in post, still has the ability to see a fairly accurate representation of what the final composite may look like. Now looking at our background and foreground in a preview of our composite, we've actually just taken a freeze frame of an output from my laptop that has a preview of a still from our background footage. You could also hook up a deck and actually play back the background footage live to be able to do timing and actually see how foreground activities interact with background movement. In our case today, we're just using a still. We pretty much are using this as a framing guide and also, more importantly, as a rough lighting guide. What I'm looking for here is to have a nice even balance between the tone of light on Jennifer and the quality of light on her as compared to the background. Now because we're looking at a cloudy day with overcast skies, I'm going for a much softer style of light. That's why we've used two very large broad sources. But I am looking at an area in this area of the screen that does have a little bit of blue sky coming through. So I know that there is going to have, I'm assuming, in the area of sky behind the camera, that there's some breaks in those clouds, so a little bit of natural sunlight's going to be allowed to come through. As a 3/4 rim over Jennifer's left shoulder, coming pretty much motivated from that bright patch of sky. That pretty much gives me my key, or my kicker from the front. That's coming around 3/4 front with a full skin of opal on both it and the rim. Then we have a small bounce. In this case it was the white side of a silver lame, a 4x4 silver lame, that's coming in under camera to her shadow side off of her right shoulder. This is basically to provide the radiosity from the environment, the return light that naturally bounces off of objects in the environment and always returns a bit of light to the foreground. One thing you want to try and avoid is having too much contrast in your foreground compared to your background, especially in daylight situations. There's so much light bouncing around from all sides in a daylight situation that you want to try and mimic that on stage. It's really easy because you're in a dark environment on a stage to let that contrast go too dark, which is a great way to not give away that you're actually in the location. To do our best to match our cloudy sky, we've chosen two instruments from KinoFlow, which is the VistaBeam. The VistaBeam is a large 4x soft source that provides a broad source that's still very punchy and rather quite bright. So what we've done is to position one of these off of Jennifer's left shoulder in a 3/4 rear position that I have at full brightness with a full skin of opal diffusion in front of it. The diffusion helps to break the light up and take a little bit of the edge off. If this was a brighter sunny day, I might go without the opal to try and keep harder edge shadows. In this case, I want the shadows to have a little bit more of a random wrap to them, so that opal helps with that. Then from a 3/4 front position on the same side, we've added another VistaBeam. This one I have dialed way back to only 1 or 2 of its globes to be able to offer nice little fill and kick on the front of her face off to the left side, and that also gives me a nice wrap to the shadow side. One of the things you want to be careful of is to not have too deep of a shadow when you're shooting daylight exterior. Daylight has a tendency to bounce through the environment from all directions. It bounces off of buildings, adjacent cars, even the ground below. So what we've done is to add a 4x4 silver lame. We're using the white side of the silver lame, the shiny white, to bounce and return some of this back VistaBeam. The high intensity VistaBeam is actually being returned as a kicker to come in from underneath the shadow side. This low angle helps to fill the shadows and makes it feel like it's coming from the sand and earth and shrubbery and whatever may be in the environment from in front of Jennifer. Now what I'd like to show you is the effect that our VistaBeams are having, specifically as they fall on our model Jennifer. What we're looking for is a large 3/4 soft source coming 3/4 rear off of her left shoulder. This is to mimic the sunlight that would be coming from the bright spot, the break in the clouds in our background plate, and also to provide a certain amount of modeling across the front of Jennifer's face as it interacts with her hair and also across her chest. Because it's a large soft source, we're actually going to get a nice sheen that feels very much like daylight. If we're going with a smaller specular source, say uncorrected Fresnel or even an open-face lamp, that hard source would create a really harsh shadow and one that doesn't provide much in the way of reflective surface for the skin. So the skin would tend to read as being more matte and have less shine to it and feel a little bit less like natural daylight. Now we also have another vista beam that's coming as a 3/4 frontal. This I'm using as essentially my skylight, or the bounce that's coming from the natural wrap of the sky itself. Where the one vista beam is actually acting as my primary sun source, this is that sun bouncing off of all the clouds in the environment and the sky itself. Typically, if it was a bright sunny day where you have a blue sky, I may cool this lamp down just a little bit to mix my colors. That mixture is because the sky itself in a blue scenario actually returns blue light as a bounce. So I'll usually try and mix that accordingly. But in our background plate today, we only have a cloudy sky that actually shows a little warmth in those clouds. They're storm clouds, so they have a little bit more warmth to them. So I'm not cooling this lamp down under the circumstances today. We also have our bounce that's returning the light from this vista beam as a bounce source to fill in the shadow side on Jennifer's face. But the main thing I want you to pay attention to is the way this vista beam is actually creating a nice little set of highlights across her face and across her chest. That is what gives the feeling of daylight, having some of that interactive light that's not a direct front source that washes her out and makes her feel like she's one flat tone, but having a little bit of cross light to provide modeling and bring out some of the texture in her features and the texture in her wardrobe as well. That's what we're looking for. This is also a great opportunity for interactive light. If you find yourself with a foreground object that's, say, next to traffic or is in an area where something's moving, letting that bounce light, as opposed to your direct light, act as your interactive light, whether it be having a grip pass a flag in front of it to mimic a passing car. Doing it to the fill light keeps the effect subtle, but allows you to feel the environment impacting the foreground. Another thing to keep in mind, along with the laundry list of things we've told you so far, in addition to your lighting and camera angle, is what the environment may be doing in terms of wind. If you're in a situation where you're in an environment like our background that has a high amount of environmental wind, you want to try and supplement that on stage as well. It's a great way to keep the foreground active and also to make it match the background better. In this case, we're using something called a squirrel cage fan. It's basically a fan that pulls air from one side and blows it out through a narrow nozzle. It's a nice way to move a lot of air in a very concentrated beam of air. Otherwise, if you were to, say, use a larger, like a box fan or something from your house, that has a tendency to spread the air out through the entire environment. It moves the air in a more random way. This is much easier to control. This port focuses the air into a beam of movement that is easier to control when you're on stage. Now, in our situation with our background plate, we're actually trying to match the ambient wind that's occurring in our background scene. If you take a look at the footage, you'll notice that the leaves are blowing, there's trees bending in the wind, there's a fair amount of movement happening in the background. It would feel unnatural if our foreground element didn't have any similar movement happening with her. Another nice feature of the squirrel cage fan is it's relatively quiet for its size and for the amount of air that it blows. You'll notice when I turn it on, it does generate some noise, but that's partially because I'm standing right next to it. The nice thing with that beam is it can throw the air in one concentrated area over a longer distance. So it allows you to move the fan further away from the subject than you would with, say, a box fan, helping you to also minimize the sound if you happen to be doing a dialogue scene in your green screen. So let's turn it on and see what effect it has on Jennifer's hair. We're going to bring it up to its slowest setting. And then once it's on, just slowly direct it until we start to get the effect we're looking for. You'll see how concentrated the beam is when you realize that only a few degrees of change means that she's feeling almost no air whatsoever versus the full focus of the beam. Now, if we happen to find ourselves in a situation where we have gale force winds, you do have the ability to crank up your squirrel cage to create a pretty dramatic effect. And action. Good.
And did you have up a dark top?
I've got a gray and a dark brown.
Yeah, a gray would be great. Something that's totally neutral. All right, so I'm ready. Same exact action handed by the director. Oh, there's this little piece of white lint right here on your left side. Yeah, right there. Yeah, right there. Okay. And go for it anytime.
Camera speeds. And action.
This doesn't want you to do it, but realizing that those are crows, they're actually crows, the birds that are flying.
Oh.
So I want you to totally like just give me like think about something really
Foreboding.
depressing, honestly. You know.
Okay.
Find something depressing.
Okay.
Do the method.
A speeds
Go for it.
and action. Watching the ravens. Bad crows. The crows are gone.
Try to swing from your upper body up rather than with your legs.
So turning.
Yeah, I don't want you to just like that. I want you to
Okay.
travel in the frame from left to right. That's
Mhm.
it. Thank you.
Camera speeds and action. Terrific.
Cool.
That's good.
All right, it's a wrap.
Yay! Thanks for watching the Digital Cinema Course Training Guide for Compositing and Blue and Green Screen Shooting. We hope you learned something new today and enjoyed the time we spent together. Thanks for watching. Happy shooting.
Hello and welcome to the Digital Cinema Course Digital Keying Guide post-production section. This is going to be about 1 or 2 minutes just to kind of get you introduced to how to create a composite with the footage that we provided for you in the in this DVD number 4. You can either use the SD standard definition portion of the DVD that we provided, which allows you to bring in the footage directly from the DVD through your camera or some other means into your editor, into your editing system at SD quality 720 by 480, or you can copy and paste the DVD-ROM section of the DVD, which is about a 3.5 gigabyte file, which has all of the exact same footage that's on the SD portion of the DVD, but in full HD 1080i. So this is the software that we're going to be using to demonstrate how to create a basic composite in post-production. This is made by Ultimat. It's called Ultimat Advantage, and it is not a software that maybe is available to everyone who's going to be watching this DVD, and we understand that. That's why we're not going to really go over how to use Ultimat Advantage per se. We're just going to give you general principles on how to create a composite in post. As you can see, we have the image of Jennifer Lewis, and she's holding the binoculars against her face, against the blue background. This is the image that we've already taught you very carefully how to create in the field, and now we're going to show you how to composite it and how to take away this blue area that dominates the frame and essentially cut it out so that only Jennifer is visible over a different background. With the Ultimat software, it's a very simple process. You really just have to click on this button that says Sample Backing right here, and essentially you can click anywhere on this blue area that seems to represent the best exposure of the blue screen background. Let's just say right here. Now we understand that with other compositing software, it may not be this simple. You may have to do a little bit more work and more tweaking, but that's up to you to find with your particular manual. What we're going to show you is just in principle how to create a composite. So with the Advantage software, you just have to select essentially anywhere here in this area, in this blue screen area, because it was lit so carefully by our DP, and the software will do all the compositing for you. And you can see when we click on the matte button over here that the white area over here in the center, that's the actual opaque portion of the frame that is occupied by Jennifer. And the black area over here is actually the clear or transparent portion that used to be the blue screen and now has been cut out and will allow some other background to come through. To see it a little bit more easily, we're going to click on this composite button over here, and you can see it against the gray background. We're going to select a different color. Let's just say this color over here, or let's just say a green color or another blue. And you can easily see that we have full control over this background now. She has been completely cut out of this frame. So all this is now transparent, and we can easily see it if we click this button, which is kind of like a Photoshop type background button, which allows you to clearly see that there is nothing there anymore. It's completely hollow. So going back to, let's say, this color right here, or this one, what we're going to do is essentially crop out the elements of the frame right now that are not going to be used in the final composite, which are kind of actually eventually will throw off your compositing. We're going to come over here to the left hand side and grab this guide right here. We're going to drag it over until it just passes the flag, and notice that the flag just disappears immediately. And we're going to do the same thing on the right hand side, and that disappears as well. Now we're going to select the hand icon over here, or the pan tool, and bring the image down just a bit. We're going to select the top guide right there. It's a little bit tricky. There we go. And drag that down. And there goes the top of the frame as well too. And now, when we click on the frame, you see that the flags that used to be there before are completely gone. So this is the original image. You can notice that these are the flags that we shot in the studio. And remember, the reason that David Smith selected these flags is because he wanted to minimize the amount of flare coming in from the blue screen into the lens of the camera, which is a very smart thing to do. And remember, he told you can use a garbage matte later on in post, or you can crop them out with some kind of a guide tool that you may have available in your post-production compositing software. This is it right here. Those are the guides that we used. We can take them back just a bit, and then notice when we go back to the matte, see, you have this white area over here that's opaque again. Remember, anything that's white is actually opaque, which is what's going to be in the final composite. Anything that's black is transparent. So when we drag this guide over again just a hair, there goes that flag. It's completely gone now. And we notice that we have a clean matte. It's very nice. Now, the cool thing about Ultimatte is it actually creates the spill suppression for you, which is the part of the software that eliminates the blue that kind of wraps around into the area that the subject occupies. And we're going to zoom in a little bit so we can try to see what we mean by spill suppression. Selecting the hand icon again, or the pan tool after the zoom tool. You'll notice, see this area right here? That's the part that actually where the background itself, right here, the actual blue screen portion of the background, spills into the foreground, which is where Jennifer's outfit is right there. That line of area can be controlled very carefully by the spill suppression, the algorithm that's actually inside Ultimatte. Like I said, different compositing software will have different variances of spill suppression that you can, bring in or take out. But that is what we mean by spill suppression. This is spill right there, just like David showed you back in the field, and you can control that with certain controls here in Ultimatte or with other types of compositing software. And you can reduce or increase the amount of spill suppression that is taking place by working these controls over here. If you click on More in Advantage, you have a lot more controls that allow you to set the exact matte density, the backing, etc., everything. But that is only specific to Ultimatte, so we're not going to teach that right now. That's something you can learn from your own manual. So once we're done with this particular portion, now that we're done showing you how to create a composite, we're going to click on the zoom tool over here, and then the pan tool, bring the image down just a hair. Click on this to make sure that the matte is still there and looks good. This is our composite. looking at it in a different color, just so we know that we've cut it out properly. This was the original image. This is the composite right there. And we're gonna click on OK. And we'll notice that Jennifer pops up against the background that we had created before. So this is the background that we had shot on a completely separate day, other than the day when we shot the foreground, which was Jennifer. So the background was shot with the exact same lens, with the exact same height of the camera, and the same angle. So that when we paste in essentially the foreground image, which is Jennifer, it will look exactly like it belongs on top of that background. So this is called the background plate. When we bring in the foreground plate, which is the one that we had shown you before, that's Jennifer, which had been cut out of the blue screen area, this is what we're going to have. The Advantage software essentially will cut out all the areas around Jennifer and composite her against this particular background. Now that we have our foreground plate against our background plate, you'll notice that this particular metal halide light that David Smith was talking about when we were actually filming matches perfectly with this rim light that we created around the edge of her body. Remember, that was the dado light that we had in the field. And these particular lights over here, since there's two of them, create the illusion of a slightly softer light, which is this rim light that was created over here on the left side of her body and along the binoculars over here on the left-hand side, and we created that with a diva light. You'll also notice that the little bit of light that was created by the small KinoFlow light creates this wonderful eye light right here, the reflections in her eyes that make her pop from the background, and that's really all you needed. If you had lit this any more, it would look completely unrealistic. But because David created the exact amount of light necessary to make her come out, and also the angle of the light reflects off of her eyes right there, that's what makes this such a good looking image. When we click on a different part of the timeline and she puts the binoculars against her eyes, you'll notice that our matte isn't cutting off any parts of the foreground subject. So no part of her arm or her shoulder over here is being cut off by the matte, so that it looks like it's unrealistic and it looks like it was just kind of planted there. And it matches perfectly. When we click back on the image where you can see her face, essentially you'll notice that the height of the camera and the focal length and the lighting and the contrast are all perfectly matched with the background. Everything looks perfect. Essentially at this point, all you really have to do is just blur the background a little bit. Okay, so this is the image without any blurring whatsoever. Now notice that what we're going to do is we're going to apply the Gaussian blur, or any kind of a decent, good-looking blur, to the background only, not to the foreground. The foreground is sharp and nice. We don't need to apply anything to that. What we're going to do is apply a little bit of a Gaussian blur to the background. And even when you apply it in a very small amount, it actually just kind of softens the background just a little bit to make it feel like the camera was a little bit closer to Jennifer than it was to the background. The more you increase it, the more it's going to feel like it's more of a telephoto lens. And there is a certain limit. You don't want to blur it too much, because we only shot at about a 50% zoom level on our camera. So if you blur it too much, it'll feel like, oh, there's something wrong here. It doesn't quite fit. In my opinion, this is a little bit too much of a blur, this is a level 8 on the Gaussian blur in the background. I would dial it back to about half as much. Not quite as much as just the original number 2. I would dial it back to about a level 5 on the Gaussian blur. And to me, that ought to create a little bit of softness in the background to make it feel that the focal length of the camera is actually working to focus out, or to make out of focus the background and keep the foreground in focus. So now this area of the frame, all this area right here, all this stuff right here, feels like it's out of focus in a good way, and it actually feels like it's not taking attention away from Jennifer, and also it feels like it matches the focal length and the focal plane of the lens that the camera was shot with. If you play with this, if you actually go out in the field and put a subject about 6 feet away from the camera, you'll notice that at a certain zoom distance, this background will naturally be out of focus. Now, you don't want to do that. You want to actually shoot the background plate out of focus, in my opinion, because you want to be able to come into post and actually dial it in yourself to just the exact right amount. Or at least if you're going to actually shoot it in post out of focus, also shoot one clean plate, background plate that is actually in focus. That'll give you a better result, give you more flexibility in post. So now that we've shown you how to composite this foreground image and remove the blue screen background and composite it on top of a background image, which is this background right here, we've also shown you how to blur out the background just a little bit in order to make it match the focal length of the camera. So essentially, you've gone through the lighting process, all the camera settings and all the camera controls. You've got a good composite. There's really not a lot more that you have to do to this frame to make it look convincing, but now it's up to you aesthetically to come back to this, and if you want to, make it match even better. The easiest way to do that is something that David Smith had mentioned back in the field, which is to go and add a lens flare to each one of these lights. Now I'm going to leave this up to you to do, because not all nonlinear editors have the ability to add lens flares. Not everybody has After Effects or some kind of a package that allows you to add lens flares. But one thing that you can do is add lens flares to these lights, which will make it feel that these lights were actually lighting the foreground even more. It'll just kind of tie it all in together. Here's one effect that you can do just to kind of enhance the ambiance and make it look like it's more realistic. Watch this. You can do lots of effects like that. You can do one effect like that for each one of those lights and have it go into different areas. You can actually animate that background lens flare itself, this particular beam of light right there that's coming in behind Jennifer. You can animate it, make it sweep left to right as though she's part of some kind of a she's in some kind of a complex, you know, like a prison complex or something like that. You can color it red or blue or however you want to color it. You can make each one of these beams come out of one of these. So there's one right there, another one right there, another one right there. There's a lot of things that you can do to make the foreground subject be part of the background subject and also make the background subject even more interesting and more realistic. So I hope you have fun using our footage and playing with it in your computer and get the most out of it, more than we can possibly even imagine out of it. We'd love to see what you did. If you'd like to send us a snapshot or send us a QuickTime film or something like that, please email us and let us know that you're going to do that first. And feel free to email us, so, you know, it's like a small QuickTime or small movie format that we can play on our computers here and take a look at what you've done. Really, at this point, you know, now that you've gotten all the technical stuff out of the way, the aesthetics of it or the creativity is just up to you. There's almost no stopping what you can do with this footage, or actually with your footage. If you'd like to, you know, go out and shoot some new things based on what we've done, please feel free to do that. That's what this whole thing is all about. I hope you have fun. Happy compositing.